Chapter 1. The Great Awakening. For 10,000 years, the master of mankind had sat upon the golden throne of Terra, his withered form bound to a machine of impossible complexity, his consciousness scattered across the screaming void of the warp like fragments of shattered glass. The galaxy had turned without him, wars had raged and died, and still his vigil continued, not in triumph, but in torment. Yet even legends have limits, and even the most terrible burdens must reach their breaking point. In the deepest chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where reality grew thin and the boundary between flesh and machine had long since dissolved, something stirred that had not stirred in 10 millennia. The Golden Throne's ancient mechanisms, worn beyond all repair yet still functioning through will alone, suddenly blazed with new purpose. Psychic energy that had been building for centuries like pressure behind a dam finally reached its crescendo, not in destruction, but in transformation. The Emperor's awareness flickered like a candle guttering back to life. For the first time in 10,000 years, his consciousness gathered itself from the scattered winds of the Imperium and settled into something resembling coherent thought. The sensation was agony and ecstasy combined, as if every nerve in his body was being reborn from ash and shadow. His first coherent thought was not of victory or vindication, but of surprise. He was awake, truly awake, not merely maintaining the endless psychic beacon that held the Imperium together. The Astronomicon still burned, but it no longer required his complete attention. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the delicate balance that had kept him suspended between life and death for 100 centuries. Sensation returned to his body in waves that threatened to overwhelm him. His fingers, which had not moved in 10,000 years, twitched against the armrests of the Golden Throne. The movement sent cascades of neural fire racing up his arms as nerves long dormant suddenly remembered their purpose. His withered flesh, sustained by the throne's arcane mechanisms and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, began to respond to his will rather than merely enduring. The Emperor opened his eyes, and for the first time in 10 millennia, he truly saw. The sight that greeted him was not the clean, purposeful machinery of the throne room as he remembered it, but something that had grown twisted and baroque over the long centuries of his vigil. Golden eagles had been carved into every surface, their wings spread wide in poses of divine majesty. Incense burners hung from chains, wreathed in sacred oils, filling the chamber with cloying smoke that spoke of worship rather than function. The walls that had once been adorned with the simple iconography of the imperial truth now blazed with religious imagery that made his soul recoil. This was not the throne room of a secular emperor. This was a shrine to a god he had never claimed to be. The Emperor's jaw worked soundlessly as he tried to form words that had not passed his lips since the day Horus struck him down. His throat, dry as ancient parchment, refused to obey at first. But his will was stronger than flesh, stronger than time itself, and slowly the machinery of speech remembered its function. The first sound that emerged was barely a whisper, a breath of air across vocal cords that had been still for longer than some civilizations had existed. Then, with growing strength, his voice found its shape, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of absolute authority even weakened as it was. The master of mankind spoke his first word in 10,000 years. No. The word echoed in the shrine chamber, bouncing off walls that had been carved with prayers in his honor, reverberating through air thick with the smoke of offerings made to his divine majesty. It was a rejection, a denial, a fundamental refusal of everything his eyes beheld. This was not what he had built. This was not what he had died for. The Golden Throne's systems responded to his awakening with displays of light that had not illuminated in centuries. Ancient screens flickered to life, showing readouts in languages that predated the Imperium itself. The psychic field that had held his consciousness in stasis began to withdraw, no longer needed now that his will had reasserted itself. For the first time since the Horus heresy, the Emperor of mankind was truly conscious and in control of his own body. Outside the throne chamber, the Adeptus Custodes who had maintained their vigil for 10,000 years felt the change like a tremor in their souls. Captain General Valoris, who had commanded the Emperor's bodyguard for centuries without ever hearing his master's voice, suddenly staggered as psychic pressure he had grown accustomed to shifted and focused. The 10 custodians standing guard outside the throne room felt their patron's presence blazing like a sun where, before, there had been only the faintest ember. The massive doors to the throne chamber, sealed by tradition and necessity for millennia, began to groan as ancient servos received commands they had not processed since the dark days of the heresy. The Emperor was calling his guardians to him, and no force in the galaxy could delay their response. As the first custodian crossed the threshold into the throne chamber, his golden armor gleaming in the newfound radiance emanating from his master, the Emperor fixed him with eyes that burned with the light of distant stars. For a moment that stretched into eternity, master and guardian regarded each other across the gap of 10,000 years. Then the Emperor spoke again, his voice growing stronger with each word, carrying an authority that could reshape worlds and break the will of gods. "Summon my Praetorians," he commanded, his gaze never leaving the kneeling custodian's helm. "I would know what has become of my Imperium." The galaxy trembled. The long sleep was over, and the master of mankind had awakened to judge what his children had wrought in his name. Whether that judgment would bring salvation or damnation, only time would tell. But in that moment, as consciousness returned fully to the one who had once walked among the stars as conqueror and father both, the Imperium faced a reckoning 10,000 years in the making. The Emperor was awake, and he was not pleased. Chapter 2. The Palace of Shadows. The Emperor's first step from the Golden Throne in 10,000 years sent tremors through the very foundations of the imperial palace. His legs, withered by millennia of immobility, trembled with the effort of supporting his frame. Yet his will was absolute, and slowly, inexorably, the master of mankind rose from his ancient seat of torment and placed his feet upon the sanctified floor of Terra. The sensation was overwhelming. Every nerve in his body screamed as blood that had flowed through arcane mechanisms for 100 centuries suddenly coursed through natural channels. His muscles, atrophied beyond all measure, responded to commands they hadn't received since the dark days of the Horus heresy. Each movement was agony, each breath a triumph over the accumulated weight of ages. Captain General Valoris knelt before his awakened master, his golden armor reflecting the ethereal light that now blazed from the Emperor's form. Yet when he spoke, his words carried a reverence that struck the Emperor like a physical blow. "My God, Emperor," Valoris began, his voice thick with awe and devotion. "Your divine awakening brings light to—" "Stop!" The word cut through the air like a blade, silencing the custodian mid-sentence. The Emperor's eyes, burning with the light of distant stars, fixed upon his guardian with an intensity that could have melted ceramite. "I am not divine. I am not a god. I am a man. Nothing more." The confusion that flickered across Valoris's features was visible even through his ornate helm. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes had maintained their vigil not merely over an emperor, but over the God-Emperor of mankind, the divine father of humanity itself. To hear their master reject his own godhood was to hear the very foundations of their existence crumble. "But my lord," Valoris stammered, his certainty shaken, "the Lectitio Divinitatus teaches us that—" "The what?" The Emperor's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a roar. "What did you just say?" Before Valoris could respond, the Emperor was moving, his steps growing steadier with each stride as his body remembered its ancient strength. He swept past his kneeling guardians and approached the massive doors that led deeper into the palace, doors that had once opened onto chambers of learning and governance, not worship and superstition. The sight that greeted him beyond the throne room threshold was a nightmare made manifest in gold and marble. Where once the corridors of the imperial palace had been adorned with the clean lines of imperial truth iconography, eagles representing conquest, cogs symbolizing the union of flesh and machine, stars marking humanity's dominion over the galaxy, now every surface blazed with religious imagery. Massive murals covered the walls, depicting the Emperor not as the secular leader he had been, but as a divine figure wreathed in holy light, standing triumphant over demons and Xenos alike. Incense burners the size of hab blocks hung from the vaulted ceilings, their smoke creating a perpetual haze that reeked of sanctification. Prayer wheels turned endlessly in alcoves that had once housed tactical cogitators. Sacred texts in high Gothic covered surfaces that had once displayed stellar cartography and military dispatches. This was not the palace he had built. This was a temple, vast beyond measure, dedicated to a god he had never claimed to be. The Emperor's pace quickened as he moved through corridors that had become alien to him. Each turn revealed fresh horrors to his eyes. Chambers that had once served as briefing rooms for the Great Crusade now housed massive shrines where tech priests chanted binary hymns to the Omnissiah, himself by another name. Halls that had echoed with the strategic discussions of primarchs now rang with the prayers of pilgrims who had traveled from across the galaxy to worship at the feet of their divine emperor. His retinue of custodians followed in his wake, their golden forms casting long shadows in the flickering candlelight that had replaced the clean illumination of his era. They moved with the precision of warriors, but their gait carried the weight of priests, and their whispered communications were punctuated by benedictions spoken in his name. "How long?" The Emperor's voice echoed through a gallery that had once displayed the artifacts of compliant worlds, but now showcased the relics of martyrs who had died screaming his name. "How long has my palace been—" "This?" Valoris approached carefully, as if walking on ground that might crack beneath his feet. "My lord, the transformation began within centuries of your ascension to the Golden Throne. The people needed hope, needed something to believe in as the galaxy burned around them. The faith in your divinity has been the cornerstone of imperial unity for 9 millennia. The Emperor stopped before a massive stained-glass window that depicted him battling the War Master Horus. But in this version, he was wreathed in divine light, wielding not the Emperor's sword, but a blade of pure holy fire. Angels, clearly meant to be his primarchs, surrounded him in poses of worship rather than brotherhood. 9 millennia, he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. For 9,000 years, my people have worshipped me as a god. Through the great window, he could see the vast courtyards of the palace grounds, and what he witnessed there struck him like a physical blow. Thousands upon thousands of pilgrims filled the spaces that had once hosted military parades and strategic gatherings. They crawled on their bellies across blessed flagstones, many weeping openly as they approached the palace's sacred precincts. Some bore stigmata that wept tears of blood, while others carried icons of the emperor that blazed with artificial halos. Children, some no older than 10 standard years, sang hymns in praise of the god emperor, while their parents prostrated themselves before shrines built in his honor. Everywhere he looked, he saw humanity debased not by conquest or oppression, but by faith. Faith in him. The sight of a young girl, her eyes closed in religious ecstasy as she pressed her lips to a golden icon bearing his likeness, finally broke something fundamental within the emperor's psyche. This was not veneration, born of respect or loyalty. This was worship in its purest, most debasing form. "They think I am divine," he said, his voice barely audible even to his superhuman guardians. "They crawl and grovel and debase themselves before images of my face, and they think this honors me." Behind him, a new voice spoke, deeper and older than Valoris, belonging to Tribune Axial, one of the few custodians old enough to remember the earliest days of the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne. "My God Emperor," the ancient warrior said, his words heavy with 10,000 years of accumulated faith, "your divinity has been the light that guided humanity through its darkest hours. The Imperial Creed teaches that." "The Imperial Creed!" The Emperor whirled, his eyes blazing with fury that could have ignited plasma. There was no Imperial Creed. There was the Imperial Truth, the promise of reason and knowledge over superstition and ignorance. I outlawed religion, banned the worship of gods, and fought to free humanity from the chains of faith. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in 10 millennia, the custodians found themselves confronted with a master whose words directly contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. Their confusion was palpable, their certainty shaken to its very foundations. Yet even as they struggled with this revelation, the sounds of worship continued to rise from the courtyards below. Hymns in a dozen languages praised the God Emperor's mercy and justice. Prayers requested his divine intercession in matters both cosmic and mundane. The faithful called upon their divine Father to deliver them from heresy and Xenos corruption. The Emperor pressed his hands against the great window, his fingers leaving glowing prints upon the ancient glass. Below him, his children, for they were still his children, despite everything, continued their worship with fervor that would have been magnificent had it not been so completely opposed to everything he had sought to build. "What have they made of my dream?" he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "What have they made of my great work?" The question hung in the air like a funeral shroud, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The master of mankind had awakened to find himself transformed, not by his own will or action, but by the desperate faith of a species that had needed a god more than they had needed an emperor. In the distance, the great bells of the palace began to toll, their bronze voices carrying across Terra the news that had already begun to spread through astropathic channels across the galaxy. The God Emperor had awakened. The divine Father of humanity had returned to his faithful children. But the Emperor, looking upon the transformed heart of his empire, knew with terrible certainty that what had awakened was not what his people expected. He was not their God, had never been their God, and could never be their God. Yet as the worship continued below and the prayers rose around him, he began to understand the first, most devastating truth of his awakening. His people might need their God more than they needed their emperor, and that realization filled him with a horror deeper than any he had known in 10,000 years of torment upon the Golden Throne. Chapter 3. The Lectitio Divinitatus. The Emperor stood in what had once been his personal study, a chamber where he had once contemplated the great works of science and philosophy that would elevate humanity beyond superstition. Now, towering bookshelves that had held treatises on stellar mechanics and xenobiology groaned under the weight of religious texts, their gilded spines gleaming with titles that made his soul recoil. "The spheres of longing," he read aloud, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The canticle of tears, the benedictions of the God Emperor." His fingers traced along leather bindings embossed with aquilus, wrapped in prayer scrolls. "What is this? This collection of theology?" Tribune Axial approached with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. In his ancient hands he carried a tome bound in what appeared to be sanctified human skin, its pages edged in gold leaf and marked with ribbon bookmarks of deep crimson. "My God, Emperor," the custodian said, his voice thick with reverence that had once been reserved for the Emperor's scientific achievements. "This is the Lectitio Divinitatus, the most sacred text of the Imperial Creed. It was written by your son, Lorgar, before his fall to the ruinous powers." The Emperor's hand froze inches from the proffered tome. "Lorgar wrote this?" The memory struck him with the force of a plasma bolt. Lorgar Aurelian, the word-bearer, the most faithful of his sons. The Emperor recalled with perfect clarity the day he had humiliated the Primarch and his legion on Monarchia, forcing them to kneel in the ashes of their perfect city because they had chosen worship over conquest, faith over reason. "Show me," he commanded, though every instinct screamed against it. Axial opened the tome with reverent care, revealing pages covered in flowing high Gothic script interspersed with illuminated marginalia, depicting the Emperor in various poses of divine majesty. The words seemed to burn themselves into the Emperor's consciousness as he read, "Hearken to the words of Lorgar, first chaplain of the God Emperor, and know the truth that has been revealed. The Emperor is not merely a man elevated to rule, but the living embodiment of humanity's collective will made manifest in flesh. He is our Father, our Protector, our God." The Emperor's jaw clenched so tightly that the sound of grinding teeth echoed through the chamber. "Continue," he said, through lips that barely moved. "Let no man say the Emperor is merely mortal, for mortality is the province of the weak and the foolish. He who guides the Astronomicon burns with divine fire. He who sits upon the golden throne does so not as king, but as deity incarnate. To deny his divinity is to deny the very light that keeps the darkness at bay." Enough. The word cracked like a whip, but Axial continued turning pages as if compelled by some force beyond his control. The imperial truth was but the first veil lifted from humanity's eyes, revealing reason over chaos. But reason itself is merely the first step toward the ultimate truth, that our Emperor is the one true God, and all who kneel before him shall know salvation. The Emperor snatched the tome from Axial's hands and hurled it across the chamber. The ancient binding burst upon impact with the wall, scattering sanctified pages like falling leaves. Yet even torn and scattered, the words seemed to mock him from every corner of the room. "Lorgar," he whispered, the name carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated betrayal. "My most faithful son wrote the foundation of everything I sought to destroy. Through the great windows of the study, the sounds of evening prayers drifted up from the palace courtyards. Thousands of voices joined in hymnal praise that had been sung for 90 centuries, their words carrying a fervor that would have moved mountains. God Emperor, deliver us from the darkness. God Emperor, shield us from the heretic. God Emperor, grant us strength in battle, God Emperor. Accept our souls in death." Each word struck the Emperor like a physical blow. This was not the humanity he had sought to create. This was not the species he had intended to guide to greatness among the stars. These were not rational beings embracing science and reason, but supplicants debasing themselves before an altar of their own construction. Captain General Valoris entered the chamber, his armor bearing fresh ceremonial decorations that the Emperor did not recognize, prayer seals and purity marks that had not existed during his conscious reign. Behind him walked a figure that made the Emperor's blood freeze in his veins. The man was dressed in the elaborate robes of high ecclesiastical office, his vestments bearing the dual-headed eagle of the Imperium wrapped in chains of gold and silver. Upon his breast hung a pendant depicting the Emperor seated upon the golden throne. But in this representation, he was clearly divine, crowned with a halo of stars and wielding lightning as both scepter and sword. "My God, Emperor," Valoris announced with deep ceremony, "may I present Cardinal Valdorius, High Celebrant of the Adeptus Ministorum and Keeper of the Sacred Flame." The Cardinal prostrated himself upon the chamber floor with a fervor that spoke of absolute faith. "My divine lord," he gasped, his voice thick with tears of religious ecstasy. "Your awakening fulfills the prophecies written in the Canticle of Transcendence. The faithful across 10,000 worlds have prayed for this moment of divine revelation." "Rise," the Emperor commanded, his voice carefully controlled, despite the fury building within him. "Tell me of this. Adeptus Ministorum." Cardinal Valdorius rose but kept his eyes cast downward, as if looking directly upon the Emperor might blind him with divine radiance. "We are your holy servants, my God Emperor, shepherds of the faithful across the galaxy. For 9,000 years, we have preserved the imperial creed, maintained the sacred rituals, and ensured that every human soul knows of your divine mercy and justice. How many?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "How many worlds follow this faith?" "All of them, Divine One," the Cardinal replied with pride that rang like cathedral bells. 1,000,000 worlds and countless orbital habitats, every last human settlement from the galactic core to the eastern fringe. Quadrillions of souls raised from birth to know your glory and offer their lives in your service. The number struck the Emperor like a collapsing star. Quadrillions! Every human being in the galaxy, raised from birth to worship him as a god he had never claimed to be. "And the imperial truth?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. The Cardinal's expression darkened, his face twisting with righteous disgust. "The blasphemous lies of the imperial truth are the greatest heresy ever conceived, my lord. To claim that you are merely human, to deny your divine nature, to speak against the holy doctrines of the imperial creed. Such words carry the penalty of death by flame. The Ordo Hereticus ensures that not one voice is raised in support of such vile falsehood." The silence that followed was profound. The Emperor stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the complete inversion of everything he had built. His great work of reason and enlightenment had not merely been corrupted, it had been declared the ultimate heresy. "Show me," he said finally, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Show me what you do in my name." The journey through the palace to the great cathedral sanctum took less than an hour, but to the Emperor it felt like crossing the gulf between galaxies. Every corridor they passed through bore witness to the religious transformation of his empire. Tech priests knelt before shrine alcoves containing his image, their mechadendrites weaving intricate patterns of worship as they chanted binary hymns to the Omnissiah. Scribes illuminated manuscripts depicting his great deeds, each one showing him performing miracles rather than wielding science and strategy. The cathedral sanctum itself had been built within what was once the palace's primary strategic command center, where holographic displays had once shown the progress of the Great Crusade across the galaxy. Now massive stained glass windows depicted the Emperor's ascension to godhood. Where tactical officers had once planned the liberation of human worlds, now thousands of pilgrims knelt in endless prayer. At the chamber's heart stood an altar of black marble inlaid with gold, upon which rested artifacts claimed to be relics of the Emperor's mortal life. A sword that was supposedly his first blade, fragments of armor said to have been worn during the Unification Wars, a scroll bearing words allegedly written in his own hand, declaring his divine nature and commanding humanity's worship. Every word upon that scroll was a lie, every relic a fabrication, every prayer offered at that altar a mockery of everything he had fought to achieve. As the evening ceremony began, the Emperor watched in growing horror as Cardinal Valdorius led the assembled faithful through rituals of supplication and sacrifice. A young woman stepped forward, bearing an infant she declared to be her offering to the God Emperor's service. The child would be taken to serve the Schola Progenium, raised from birth to die in the Emperor's name without ever knowing freedom or choice. An aged veteran of the Imperial Guard knelt before the altar and opened his veins, allowing his blood to flow onto the sanctified stone as a demonstration of his willingness to die for his divine master. The crowd chanted approval as his life ebbed away in service to a god who had never asked for such sacrifice. Children no older than 10 recited catechisms declaring the Emperor's divinity, while their parents wept with joy at their offspring's piety. Every word they spoke was a nail in the coffin of rational thought, every prayer a chain binding humanity to ignorance and superstition. Every day, Cardinal Valdorius whispered to the Emperor as the ceremony reached its crescendo. Across every world in your divine realm, millions make similar offerings. They die gladly, knowing their sacrifice serves your eternal glory. Millions, every day, for 10,000 years. The mathematics were staggering. Trillions upon trillions of human lives, snuffed out not in service to humanity's advancement or protection, but in worship of a deity who had never existed. The greatest minds of their generation, reduced to chanting prayers instead of advancing science. The bravest hearts sacrificing themselves for faith rather than fighting for progress. As the ceremony concluded and the faithful departed, many crawling backward from the altar so as not to turn their backs on the sacred space. The Emperor stood alone among the icons of his own false divinity. The weight of realization pressed down upon him like a mountain of lead. He had awakened to find himself the god of a galaxy-spanning religion built upon the complete corruption of every ideal he had held sacred. His imperial truth, the foundation stone of human enlightenment, had become the ultimate heresy, punishable by death. His children, the species he had sought to elevate, had been reduced to groveling supplicants who offered their lives to satisfy the hunger of a god who had never wanted their worship. For the first time since his awakening, the Emperor allowed himself to consider a terrible question. Had his great work been so fundamentally flawed that its complete inversion was not merely possible, but inevitable? The thought filled him with a despair deeper than any he had known upon the Golden Throne. For 10,000 years he had endured agony believing that his sacrifice served a purpose, that his torment preserved something worth preserving. But what if he had been wrong? What if the Imperium that worshipped him was not a corruption of his vision, but its logical conclusion? The question hung in the sanctified air like a funeral shroud, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. In the distance, the great bells of Terra began to toll midnight, their bronze voices carrying across a world where quadrillions slept secure in their faith that a loving God watched over them from his golden throne. But the Emperor, standing amid the relics of his own false divinity, knew with terrible certainty that gods who love their worshippers do not allow them to die by the billions in service to lies. And yet they did die, gladly and with songs upon their lips, believing until their final breath that their suffering served a divine purpose. The horror of it threatened to drive him mad. Chapter 4. Lords of a Broken Throne. The council chamber of the High Lords of Terra had once been the Emperor's personal strategic planning room, where he had sat with his primarchs to map the conquest of the galaxy. Now, as he entered the vast space for the first time in 10,000 years, he found it transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the architect of the Great Crusade. 12 thrones of obsidian and gold dominated a circular table of black marble, each seat representing one of the High Lords who had, in his absence, assumed the mantle of governing humanity's million worlds. The simplicity of function that had once defined imperial architecture had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic ornamentation. Every surface bore the stamps and seals of 1,000 different administrative departments, their overlapping authorities creating a web of confusion that would have challenged even a primarch to unravel. "My God, Emperor," announced Captain General Valoris as the massive doors groaned shut behind them. "The High Lords of Terra await your divine judgment." The 12 figures who rose from their thrones to kneel before him represented the pinnacle of imperial power, yet the Emperor found himself studying not conquerors or visionaries, but administrators. These were not the warriors and scholars who had once advised him on the liberation of human worlds, but bureaucrats who had spent lifetimes maneuvering for position within a governmental machine that had grown beyond all reason. At their head knelt Lord Commander Militant Trazine Barbarossa, master of the Astra Militarum, his uniform heavy with ceremonial decorations that spoke more of political maneuvering than battlefield prowess. To his left, Fabricator General Xylos Theta. 7-7 maintained the position of supplication, despite the mechanical augmentations that had replaced most of his humanity with cold logic circuits. "Rise," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying across the chamber like the tolling of funeral bells. "Tell me what you have made of my Imperium." The silence that followed was profound. For 10,000 years, these 12 individuals had wielded absolute authority over humanity's destiny, answerable to no one save the silent figure upon the golden throne. Now, faced with that figure, awakened and questioning, they found themselves as lost as children called to account by an absent father. Lord High Admiral Korath of the Imperial Navy was the first to find his voice, though it trembled with a mixture of reverence and barely concealed panic. "My lord, the Imperium prospers under our stewardship. 1,000,000 worlds acknowledge your divine authority, and the tithe fleets carry the wealth of the galaxy to Terra in your honor." 1,000,000 worlds, the Emperor repeated, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "And how many of those worlds have been lost to administrative error? How many have fallen to alien invasion while their distress calls gathered dust in some bureaucrat's filing cabinet? How many populations have starved while their food shipments were redirected to feed worlds that paid higher bribes to transportation officials?" The uncomfortable shifting among the High Lords told him everything he needed to know. These were not merely rhetorical questions, but statements of fact drawn from a reality they had hoped would never be scrutinized by their awakened master. Master of the Administratum Severian Gol rose from his throne, data slates cluttering his arms like the scales of some paper-bound reptile. He was a thin man, made gaunt by centuries of poring over ledgers and population statistics, his eyes bearing the haunted look of one who had glimpsed the true scale of imperial inefficiency and been broken by it. "My God, Emperor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Administratum processes approximately 14 billion data transmissions daily across the galaxy. Each world submits reports on population, production, military strength, and resource requirements. We endeavor to ensure that every citizen receives what they require to serve your divine will." "Show me," the Emperor commanded, gesturing toward the data slates. "Show me this marvel of efficient governance." With trembling hands, Gol activated a hololith projector that filled the center of the chamber with a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Millions of points of light represented human worlds, each one supposedly connected to Terra through an elaborate network of communication and supply lines. But as the Emperor studied the display, patterns emerged that filled him with a cold fury deeper than any he had known. Entire sectors showed red warning indicators that had been ignored for decades. Star systems marked as under review had been awaiting administrative decisions for longer than some Space Marine chapters had existed. Resource allocation charts showed massive inefficiencies, where vital supplies sat in warehouses while worlds burned for lack of ammunition. "Explain this," the Emperor said, pointing to a cluster of systems in the segmentum tempestus that pulsed with urgent distress signals. "These worlds have been requesting military aid for 47 years. Their transmissions indicate constant Xenos raids, collapsing infrastructure, and populations reduced to subsistence living. Yet I see no response from Terra, no aid convoys, no military intervention." Gol's hands shook as he consulted his data slates. "My lord, their requests were filed with the Department of Xenos Incursions, which determined that military response fell under the purview of the Departamento Munitorum. However, the Munitorum ruled that resource allocation for non-critical systems required approval from the Administrative Council of Resource Distribution, which has been awaiting the appointment of a new chairman for 38 years. The Emperor's silence was more terrifying than any roar of rage. 47 years of human suffering, of entire populations ground down by alien predation and governmental neglect, all because of bureaucratic procedure. "And while these worlds burned," he said with deadly quiet, "what occupied the attention of this council?" Lord High Admiral Korath cleared his throat nervously. "My God, Emperor, we have been engaged in vital discussions regarding the standardization of Imperial Navy uniform regulations across 17 different sector fleets. The debate has required extensive consultation with the Adeptus Mechanicus regarding fabric compositions and the Ecclesiarchy concerning appropriate devotional iconography." 47 years, the Emperor repeated, his voice growing colder with each word. 47 years of committee meetings about uniform buttons while my people died, screaming for help that never came. He turned to another section of the galactic display, where entire systems showed as classification pending. These were not worlds in distress or under threat, but human settlements that had somehow fallen through the cracks of imperial bureaucracy so completely that their very existence had become a matter of administrative debate. "Master of the Astronomicon," he said, addressing the hunched figure of Navarhef, whose ancient form was barely visible beneath layers of ceremonial robes. "How many worlds have we lost completely? Not to invasion or rebellion, but to simple administrative oversight." The ancient Psyker's response was barely audible. The current estimate suggests that approximately 12,000 human colonies established during the Great Crusade have been misplaced in the archives, my lord. Their exact locations, populations, and current status are uncertain. 12,000 worlds, potentially trillions of human lives, abandoned to fend for themselves in a hostile galaxy because some clerk had misfiled their planetary registration forms. The scale of the negligence was staggering, but it was Inquisitor Representative Torvin Rext who delivered the killing blow to any remaining faith the Emperor might have had in his government's competence. The black-armored figure stepped forward, his skull-faced helm reflecting the light of the hololith display. "My God Emperor," he said, his voice mechanically modulated through vox grills. "The Inquisition's records indicate that governmental dysfunction has become so severe that 17 separate inquisitorial investigations have been launched into corruption within the High Lords themselves over the past millennium." The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Even as the galaxy burned and human colonies disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, the rulers of the Imperium had been investigating each other for corruption and self-dealing. "Continue," the Emperor commanded, though every word was like a nail driven into his soul. Lord Commander Militant Thraxton was executed for embezzling military supplies to his personal estates on Rylith Prime. Rext continued with the dispassionate tone of a coroner reading cause of death. Master of the Administratum, Kellyan was found guilty of accepting bribes to expedite favorable resource allocations for agri-worlds owned by his extended family. Grand Master of Assassins Vex was terminated for using inquisitorial resources to eliminate political rivals within the nobility of Terra itself. Each revelation was another indictment of the system the Emperor had awakened to find ruling in his name. These were not isolated incidents of corruption, but symptoms of a governmental structure that had rotted from within until graft and self-interest had become its primary driving forces. "And while you investigated each other," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment, "while you debated uniform regulations and lost entire worlds to filing errors, what became of the common citizens whose welfare you were sworn to protect?" The silence that greeted his question was answer enough. These 12 individuals, supposedly the most powerful humans in the galaxy, had spent so long focused on their own power struggles and administrative procedures that they had forgotten the very people they claimed to serve. Lord Chancellor Phaedrus of the Estate Imperialis finally spoke, his voice thick with the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that had replaced clear communication throughout the imperial government. "My God Emperor, while certain inefficiencies may have developed within the administrative framework, the essential structure of governance remains fundamentally sound. The citizenry continues to provide loyal service, and the tithe quotas are met with acceptable variance parameters." "Acceptable variance parameters," the Emperor repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You speak of human lives as if they were entries in a ledger. You reduce the suffering of entire worlds to statistical anomalies. You have transformed the government of humanity into a machine that devours its own people to maintain its own bloated existence." He gestured to the hololith display, where the accumulated failures of 10,000 years of bureaucratic rule glowed like accusations in the chamber's dim light. "Look upon your achievements, High Lords of Terra. Worlds lost to administrative oversight. Populations abandoned to alien predation because their requests for aid were filed in the wrong department. Resources rotting in warehouses while colonies starve, all because the proper authorization forms haven't been properly stamped by officials who died centuries ago, but were never officially replaced." The Emperor's condemnation rang through the chamber like the voice of judgment itself. For the first time in 10 millennia, the High Lords of Terra found themselves confronted with an authority that could not be bargained with, bribed, or bureaucratically maneuvered around. You have created a system so Byzantine in its complexity that even you cannot navigate it, he continued, his words striking each High Lord like physical blows. A government so concerned with its own procedures that it has forgotten its purpose. An empire that exists not to serve humanity, but to perpetuate the very bureaucracy that is slowly strangling it to death. Yet even as he spoke these words of condemnation, the Emperor knew with terrible clarity that these 12 figures were not the true architects of the Imperium's dysfunction. They were merely the latest inheritors of a system that had been growing more corrupt and inefficient for 10,000 years, each generation of administrators adding new layers of procedure and oversight until the simple act of governing had become impossible. In the distance, the great bells of Terra began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across a world where quadrillions of citizens struggled to survive under the rule of a government that had lost all connection to their needs or suffering. And the Emperor, standing amid the evidence of his government's failure, began to understand that the corruption of his vision ran deeper than religious fervor or administrative incompetence. The very foundations of his Imperium had been undermined by the most human of failings. The hunger for power without responsibility, authority without accountability. The High Lords of Terra knelt before him in their golden chamber, surrounded by the apparatus of absolute power. Yet they were powerless to govern effectively even a single world, let alone a galaxy. It was perhaps the most damning revelation of all. Chapter 5. The Fates of His Sons. The Emperor stood before a massive pict screen in what had once been his personal quarters, his hands trembling as images of his sons flickered through displays chronicling 10,000 years of imperial history. Each face that appeared brought with it a cascade of memories, the first time he had found each scattered Primarch, the joy of reunion, the pride he had felt as they conquered the galaxy in humanity's name. Now, Captain General Valoris stood beside him, with data slates that contained records no father should ever have to read. The fates of the Primarchs, catalogued with the cold precision of imperial documentation, each entry a knife thrust into the Emperor's soul. "Tell me of Horus," the Emperor said, his voice barely above a whisper. The name hung in the air between them like a curse, carrying with it the weight of the greatest betrayal in human history. Valoris hesitated, his golden helm reflecting the light from the pict screen. "My lord, perhaps we should begin with Horus." The single word cut through the air with the finality of an execution warrant. "My most beloved son. Tell me what became of him." The custodian's voice was heavy with the burden of 10,000 years of accumulated sorrow. Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, fell to the corruption of the ruinous powers during the campaign on Davin. The being that returned from that world was not your son, but a creature of chaos wearing his face. The Emperor closed his eyes, and for a moment the weight of 10 millennia seemed to settle upon his shoulders like a shroud. He had known, of course. Deep in the furthest corners of his consciousness, even during his long torment upon the golden throne, he had felt the moment when his favorite son had been lost to darkness. "He led half of my legions into rebellion," the Emperor said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that tasted like poison on his tongue. "He brought war to Terra itself." "Yes, my lord." Valoris consulted his data slates with the reverence of a priest reading sacred texts. The Horus heresy consumed the galaxy for 7 years. Billions died in the civil war that followed. In the end, aboard his flagship, the vengeful Spirit, you faced him in single combat. The memories came flooding back with agonizing clarity. The battle aboard the vengeful Spirit. The moment when he had realized that nothing remained of the son he had loved, that the creature before him was a hollow shell filled with the malice of gods he had sought to deny. The terrible choice between destroying Horus utterly and preserving some fragment of hope that his son might yet be saved. "I killed him," the Emperor said, the words emerging like a confession torn from his very soul. "I destroyed my most beloved son with my own hands." "You saved humanity, my lord," Valorous replied softly. "Though the cost, the Emperor repeated, his voice growing hollow. "Show me the others. Show me what became of my sons." The first image that appeared on the picked screen drove the breath from the Emperor's lungs. Sanguinius, the angel, his magnificent wings spread wide as he stood atop the walls of the Imperial Palace during the siege of Terra. But this was not Sanguinius triumphant. This was Sanguinius dying, his body broken by the War Master's mace, his life's blood pooling on the deck of the vengeful Spirit. "Sanguinius died protecting you," Valorous explained, his voice thick with reverence. "He faced Horus knowing he would die, knowing that his sacrifice might weaken the War Master, enough for you to achieve victory. He chose death over corruption, my lord. He chose to remain your son until the end." The Emperor's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sanguinius, the most noble of his sons, the one who had embodied everything he had hoped the Primarchs might become. Dead for 10,000 years, his sacrifice remembered only in the religious iconography that now decorated every imperial shrine. "Ferus Manus," he whispered, and the picked screen responded to his words, showing the stern face of the Primarch of the Iron Hands. "Slain on Istvan V by his brother Fulgrim," Valorous confirmed, "betrayed during what should have been a campaign against traitor forces. His death was one of the first blows that began the heresy proper." Ferus, the son who had been so much like the Emperor himself, cold, logical, dedicated to perfection through technology and discipline, murdered by one of his own brothers, his head taken as a trophy by a creature that had once shared his genetic heritage. Rogel Dawn? The screen showed the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, golden armor gleaming as he supervised the fortification of the Imperial Palace. But even as the Emperor watched, the images shifted to show the later years. Dawn leading the Iron Cage campaign, pursuing traitor forces into a trap that would claim his life and the lives of thousands of his sons. "Missing, presumed dead," Valorous said carefully. "His body was never recovered, but his hand was found clutching his chainsword. The Imperial Fists venerate it as a sacred relic. Dead, missing, presumed dead." The litany of loss continued as image after image appeared on the screen. Vulcan, lost to mysterious circumstances, but carrying with him artifacts of immense power. The Khan vanished into the webway while pursuing Dark Eldar raiders. Korax disappearing into the Eye of Terror itself in pursuit of his fallen brothers. But it was the next revelation that struck the Emperor like a physical blow. "The traitors," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What became of the sons who turned against me?" Valorous' hesitation was answer enough, but the Emperor needed to hear the words spoken aloud, needed to understand the full scope of the horror that had unfolded during his absence. "Fulgrim ascended to demon princehood, becoming a creature of excess and sensation," the custodian began, his voice carefully neutral. "Perturabo rules a demon world within the Eye of Terror. Mortarion commands plague fleets that spread disease across imperial space. Angron..." Angron, the Emperor repeated, remembering the son he had failed to save from the butcher's nails, the son whose rage had consumed him even before chaos claimed his soul. Angron has become a demon prince of Khorne. He leads demonic incursions across the galaxy, slaughtering populations in the name of the blood god. He is no longer the gladiator you found on Nuceria, my lord. He is something far worse. The screen showed glimpses of the demon prince that had once been his son, a towering monster of brass and fury, its form barely recognizable as having once been human. This creature had stood at his side during the Great Crusade, had called him father, had once fought to protect humanity from the very forces that now commanded its loyalty. Magnus, the Emperor said, though he already knew what he would hear. Magnus the Red serves as a demon prince of Tzeentch. He rules the planet of the sorcerers from within the Eye of Terra, commanding legions of Chaos Space Marines and demon hosts. His psychic powers have grown beyond measure, but at the cost of everything he once claimed to champion. Magnus, the son he had tried so desperately to save, whose warnings about Horus he had ignored, whose violation of the Webway project had doomed Terra to demonic invasion. The son whose fall to chaos had been as much the Emperor's fault as anyone's. Lorgar? Also a demon prince. He dwells in the Eye of Terra, spreading the word of chaos across the galaxy. The Lectitio Divinitatus we showed you earlier was merely the beginning of his corruption of imperial doctrine. 6 of his sons, transformed into demon princes of the very powers he had sought to deny. 6 beloved children, now immortal servants of gods that fed on human suffering and despair. The thought was almost too much to bear. It was then that the chamber doors opened, and a figure entered that the Emperor recognized, but had not expected to see. Rabut Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, knelt before his gene-father with the same reverence that the custodians showed, but there was something different about him, a weariness that spoke of recent trials and terrible responsibilities. "My lord," Gilliman said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and exhaustion in equal measure. "I felt your awakening across the galaxy. The Imperium Secundus protocols I established have been activated, and I have returned to Terra to serve at your side." The Emperor stared at his son, noting the life-sustaining apparatus that helped maintain his existence, the scars of recent battles, the burden of command that sat upon his shoulders like a mountain of lead. This was not the confident young Primarch he remembered from the Great Crusade, but a warrior aged by 10,000 years of struggle. "Roboute," he said softly, the name carrying with it both joy and sorrow. "You live." "I endure, my lord," Gilliman replied, rising to his feet. "I have spent the last several years leading the Indomitus Crusade, attempting to reclaim worlds lost to chaos, Xenos invasion, and simple abandonment. The galaxy burns, Father. It burns while we struggle to hold together an empire that grows more dysfunctional with each passing century." The words struck the Emperor like hammer blows. His son, one of the few loyal sons remaining, spoke with the voice of bitter experience about the Imperium's failures. This was not a triumphant reunion between father and son, but a consultation between 2 generals surveying the aftermath of a losing war. "How many?" the Emperor asked, though he dreaded the answer. "How many of my sons remain loyal to the Imperium?" Gilliman's silence stretched for long moments before he answered. "Of the 18 known Primarchs, 6 fell to chaos during the heresy. 4 died in service to the Imperium. 2 are lost, their fates unknown. Lionel Johnson has recently awakened from his own long slumber and operates in the Imperium Nihilus. Vulcan lives, but he pursues his own mysterious agenda. Russ and Korax disappeared into the Eye of Terra, and the warp, respectively. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Of his 18 sons, 6 had become demon princes, 4 were dead, and most of the rest were missing or operating beyond imperial authority. Only 2 remained actively loyal to the Imperium he had built. Guilliman, standing before him, bearing the wounds of 10,000 years of war, and the Lion, recently awakened to find a galaxy far darker than the one he had left behind. "And the Space Marine legions?" the Emperor asked, though he already knew that answer would be equally devastating. "Broken into chapters after my own Codex Astartes reorganization," Guilliman replied. "The original legions were disbanded to prevent another Horus heresy, but the cost has been enormous. Where once we had unified forces of 100,000 Astartes, we now have scattered chapters of 1,000 warriors, many of whom have been lost to warp storms, administrative failures, or simple attrition." The Emperor closed his eyes and leaned against the great window, his reflection staring back at him from the armored glass. In that reflection, he saw not the master of mankind, who had once led the great crusade to victory across the galaxy, but an ancient being awakening to find his life's work in ruins. His sons, the greatest achievements of his genetic mastery, the demigods he had created to lead humanity to greatness, were dead, missing, corrupted, or struggling alone against impossible odds. The legions that had conquered 1,000,000 worlds had been broken into fragments. The Imperium that had promised to unite humanity under the banner of reason and progress had become a theocracy that murdered its own citizens for the crime of logical thought. "Father," Guilliman said softly, approaching the window where the Emperor stood, "I know this is not what you envisioned when you began the Great Crusade. I know the Imperium has become something you would barely recognize. But it endures. Humanity survives. And now that you have awakened, perhaps we can begin to set things right." The Emperor looked upon his son, scarred, weary, bearing the weight of an empire that was slowly collapsing despite his best efforts, and felt something crack inside his chest. This loyal son had spent 10,000 years fighting to preserve what remained of his father's vision, had sacrificed everything to hold together an Imperium that grew more dysfunctional with each passing day. "How many die daily in my name, Roboute?" the Emperor asked, his voice barely audible. Guilliman's hesitation was answer enough, but he provided the numbers anyway. The exact figure varies, but imperial estimates suggest that approximately 10 million citizens die daily across the galaxy from war, disease, starvation, and the various failures of imperial governance. Perhaps 1 million more die in the name of the imperial creed, martyrs, sacrificial offerings, and those executed for heresy. 11 million deaths per day, 4 billion per year, for 10,000 years. The Emperor pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window and allowed himself, for the first time since his awakening, to truly comprehend the scope of what his absence had cost. Not just his sons, not just his original vision for the Imperium, but the lives of countless trillions of human beings who had lived and died, believing they served a divine father who had abandoned them to suffer in his name. "The galaxy needed the Emperor," he said softly, his breath fogging the glass. "But all they got was a corpse on a throne and a religion built on lies." Behind him, Guilliman and Valoris stood in respectful silence, waiting for their master to process the full weight of 10,000 years of accumulated tragedy. But the Emperor knew there could be no processing this horror, no coming to terms with losses on this scale. He had awakened to find his sons dead, corrupted, or broken by the weight of preserving an empire that had forgotten its own purpose. The magnitude of the failure was beyond comprehension, beyond redemption, beyond any solution that did not require him to rebuild everything from the ground up. And in the distance, across Terra and a million other worlds, the faithful continued their prayers to a God who had never wanted their worship, offering their lives to a father who had failed them more completely than any parent in the history of the species. The Emperor remained at the window as the light of Terra's sun began to fade, casting long shadows across a palace that had become a mausoleum for dreams that had died 10,000 years ago. Chapter 6. The Inquisition's Shadow. The Emperor stood in a chamber that had once housed his personal library of xenobiological specimens, where he had studied the myriad alien species that humanity would encounter among the stars. Now the walls were lined with the skulls of heretics, their empty sockets staring blindly at a room that had been transformed into a shrine to paranoia and purification. Inquisitor Lord Vex Korath knelt before him in power armor, black as the void between stars, his form bristling with purity seals and devotional iconography. The man's augmetic eye whirred softly as it focused on the Emperor, its crimson lens reflecting a light that spoke of absolute certainty in the righteousness of his cause. "My God Emperor," Korath intoned, his voice mechanically modulated through vox grills that transformed human speech into something inhuman and cold. "The Order Malleus stands ready to serve your divine will. We are the hammer that shatters the corrupt, the blade that cuts away the diseased flesh of heresy from the body of your sacred Imperium." The Emperor studied this figure with growing horror. Here was a man who spoke of serving divine will while surrounding himself with the tools of torture and execution, who claimed to protect the Imperium while wielding authority that could destroy entire worlds without oversight or appeal. "Tell me of the Inquisition," the Emperor commanded, his voice carefully controlled, despite the revulsion building within him. "Tell me what you do in my name." Korath rose to his feet with the fluid motion of a predator, activating a massive hololith projector that filled the chamber with images that made the Emperor's soul recoil. Worlds burning under the fury of exterminatus weapons. Populations herded into containment camps for purification processing. Children no older than 10 being subjected to psychic interrogation to determine their loyalty to the Imperial Creed. "We are the Emperor's left hand," Korath began, his augmetic eye casting red light across the horrific display. "Where the Adeptus Astartes are your right hand of conquest, we are your left hand of judgment. We root out corruption, eliminate the heretic, purge the mutant, and ensure that your divine will is obeyed without question across every world in your sacred domain." The images shifted, showing inquisitorial fortress monasteries where suspected heretics were subjected to interrogation techniques that would have made the torturers of old night weep with envy. Men and women screamed as servo skulls carved confessions from their flesh. Children watched their parents burn for the crime of asking questions about imperial doctrine. "This is how you serve me?" the Emperor asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a roar. "By terrorizing the very people I sought to protect?" "We protect your realm from the enemies within," Korath replied, with absolute conviction. Chaos cultists who would summon demons into reality. Genestealer cults that corrupt human genetics. Tech heretics who pervert the sacred mysteries of the Omnissiah. Psychers who risk opening breaches into the warp itself. At the mention of Psychers, the Emperor's eyes blazed with fury. "Psychers!" he repeated, his psychic presence filling the chamber with pressure that made even Korath's augmetics strain against overload. "You persecute Psychers." "The witch must be burned," Korath responded automatically, his conditioning so complete that he spoke the words even as he knelt before the most powerful psyker in human history. Unsanctioned psychers are an abomination, my lord. They risk demonic possession, warp rifts, and psychic catastrophes that could consume entire star systems. The irony was so profound, it threatened to drive the Emperor mad. Here stood a man dedicated to serving him, claiming divine authority for actions that would have seen the Emperor himself burned as a witch if his true nature had been known during the dark age of technology. "Show me more," the Emperor commanded, though every instinct screamed against witnessing further horrors. The hololith display shifted to show the aftermath of an exterminatus order. What had once been a hive world of 18 billion souls was now nothing more than a cracked and burning sphere of molten rock. The planet's crime: a single cult had emerged in one of its undercities, worshipping entities that might have been chaos gods, or might simply have been local folklore elevated to religious significance. 18 billion people, the Emperor said, his voice hollow. "You murdered 18 billion of my children because of a cult that numbered perhaps 10,000. The corruption was too widespread to contain," Korath replied, with the mechanical certainty of a man who had made such decisions countless times. Purification through fire was the only solution. Better 18 billion souls die pure than live corrupted and damn countless others to similar fate. The mathematics of it were staggering. According to the data scrolling past the hololith display, the Inquisition authorized an average of 12 exterminatus actions per year. 12 worlds, with populations ranging from hundreds of millions to tens of billions, wiped clean of life because bureaucrats sitting in comfortable offices had decreed them beyond salvation. "How many worlds?" the Emperor asked, though he dreaded the answer. "In 10,000 years of your service, how many worlds have you destroyed?" Korath consulted a data slate with the calm efficiency of a clerk checking inventory. Approximately 120,000 worlds have been subjected to exterminatus protocols since the Inquisition's founding. The total population cleansed through these actions is estimated at 14 quadrillion souls, my lord. 14 quadrillion. The number was beyond comprehension, beyond any scale of tragedy that had previously existed in human history. An entire galaxy's worth of murder, committed by an organization that claimed to serve the man who stood before them. But the horrors did not end with exterminatus. The hololith continued its parade of atrocities, showing inquisitorial black ships that traveled from world to world, collecting psychers for processing on Terra. The Emperor watched in growing horror as children were torn from their families, many no older than his own primarchs had been when he had first found them scattered across the galaxy. "The psychic tithe," Korath explained with professional detachment. "Every world must provide its quota of psychers for the Emperor's service. The weak are fed to the Golden Throne to maintain the Astronomicon. The strong are trained as sanctioned psychers or astropaths. Those, too, corrupted for service, are executed for the safety of all." The Emperor watched a 10-year-old girl being dragged screaming from her mother's arms, her crime being the ability to make flowers bloom with her touch. He saw an elderly man executed for the heresy of healing his grandchildren's injuries through psychic means. Hundreds of thousands of humans with the gift that should have marked them as the next step in human evolution were instead treated as criminals whose only value lay in their ability to fuel the very machine that kept him alive. "You feed them to the Golden Throne," the Emperor said, his voice thick with disgust. "You murder my people to maintain a machine that was never meant to require such sacrifice." "It is necessary, my lord," Korath replied, his mechanical certainty never wavering. "The Astronomicon must be maintained, and the sacrifice of the few serves the many. Their deaths honor you and preserve the Imperium you built." The Emperor closed his eyes, remembering the Golden Throne's original design. It had been meant to allow him to enter the Webway project, to provide humanity with safe passage through what should have been a network of tunnels beyond the reach of chaos. The daily sacrifice of psychers had been an emergency measure, a temporary solution to keep him alive after Horus had shattered his body. Yet for 10,000 years, that emergency measure had become institutionalized murder, the foundation of a system that treated human psychics as nothing more than fuel for a machine whose original purpose had been forgotten by all save him. "The witch hunts," he said, opening his eyes to fix Korath with a stare that could have melted ceramite. "Show me the witch hunts." What followed was perhaps the most damning evidence yet of how far the Imperium had fallen. Entire populations subjected to psychic screening that often killed more people than it saved. Villages burned because someone had reported unusual behavior from a neighbor. Children executed for displaying psychic potential before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. The Emperor watched a scene from a hive world where inquisitorial agents had decreed that an entire district was corrupt because of a series of unusual births. 30 million people were herded into containment areas and subjected to purification protocols that were indistinguishable from systematic genocide. Men, women, and children died screaming, their only crime being proximity to suspected heretics. "This is justice?" the Emperor asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "This is the protection you offer my people?" "It is necessary," Korath repeated, his conditioning so complete that he seemed incapable of questioning the righteousness of any action taken in the Emperor's name. "The corruption of one can damn millions. Better to err on the side of caution than to allow heresy to spread unchecked." But it was the next revelation that broke something fundamental within the Emperor's psyche. The hololith display showed the current state of the Inquisition's authority, the web of power and paranoia that had grown to encompass every aspect of imperial life. There were no checks on inquisitorial authority, no appeals process for their judgments, no oversight body that could question their decisions. An inquisitor could declare an entire system corrupt and order its destruction on nothing more than personal suspicion. They could execute governors, generals, and even Space Marine chapter masters without trial or explanation. The organization that claimed to serve the Emperor had become a power unto itself, answerable to no one, and capable of horrors that exceeded even the worst excesses of the dark age of technology. "Who watches the watchers?" the Emperor asked, though he already knew the answer. "We watch ourselves, my lord," Korath replied with pride that rang like bronze bells in a funeral tower. "The Inquisition is incorruptible because we hold each other accountable to your divine will. When an inquisitor falls to corruption, his brothers eliminate him. When a faction within the Inquisition grows too powerful, the others bring it back into balance." The Emperor almost laughed at the insanity of it. An organization of paranoid zealots, given unlimited authority over the lives and deaths of quintillions, claiming to police itself while operating in absolute secrecy from any external oversight. "You answer to no one," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "We answer to you, my God Emperor," Korath replied with absolute conviction. "Everything we do in your name and by your will. Every heretic burned, every world purged, every psyker sacrificed to the Golden Throne. All of it serves your divine purpose." The chamber fell silent, save for the soft whirring of Korath's augmetic implants and the distant sound of prayers rising from the courtyards below. For long moments, the Emperor stood frozen by the magnitude of what he had witnessed. This was not corruption in the traditional sense. This was not the decay of good intentions or the gradual slide toward compromise and expedience. This was institutionalized horror, elevated to the level of religious doctrine, systematic brutality that claimed divine sanction for actions that defied every principle he had ever held sacred. 14 quadrillion murdered in his name, countless trillions more terrorized, brutalized, and oppressed by an organization that claimed to serve him while operating beyond any possible oversight or accountability. The Inquisition had not corrupted his vision. They had weaponized it, turning the promise of human unity and advancement into a machine for generating suffering on a scale that dwarfed every atrocity in recorded history. "Leave me," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying such authority that even Korath's conditioning could not override it. As the Inquisitor Lord departed, his augmetic footsteps echoing through corridors lined with the skulls of those deemed unworthy of life, the Emperor remained alone in the chamber, surrounded by the evidence of his empire's sins. Outside, across Terra and a million other worlds, the Inquisition continued its work. Black ships continued their harvest of psychers. Exterminatus fleets stood ready to cleanse entire worlds of life. Inquisitors sat in judgment over populations that had no recourse, no appeal, no hope of mercy, all of it done in his name, all of it claiming his authority, all of it justified by faith in a God who had never wanted to be worshipped and had certainly never commanded the systematic brutalization of his own species. The Emperor pressed his hands against his temples, feeling the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated guilt pressing down upon him like a mountain. He had awakened hoping to find an Imperium that had strayed from his vision but could be guided back to the light. Instead, he had found a machine for generating human misery on a scale that exceeded the worst nightmares of chaos itself, operated by zealots who genuinely believed they were serving his divine will. The question that haunted him now was not whether the Imperium could be reformed, but whether it deserved to exist at all. In the distance, the great bells of Terra continued their eternal toll, marking time for an empire that had transformed the promise of human advancement into a galaxy-spanning funeral pyre, all in service to a god who wept to see what his children had become. Chapter 7. A Galaxy in Chains. The Emperor stood before the greatest cogitator banks in the Imperial Palace, their ancient screens flickering with data streams that painted a picture of the galaxy more horrifying than any nightmare he had endured during his 10,000 years upon the Golden Throne. What had once been his command center for the Great Crusade now served as a monument to humanity's decline, displaying not conquest and progress, but an endless catalogue of loss, suffering, and barely contained disaster. "Show me everything," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Show me what the galaxy has become." The hololith projectors activated in sequence, filling the vast chamber with a three-dimensional map of the Milky Way that made his soul recoil. The galaxy he had once sought to unite under humanity's banner was now a scarred and broken thing, divided not by distance, but by fundamental tears in the fabric of reality itself. At the galaxy's heart, a massive wound of warp energy stretched from the Eye of Terra to the Hadron expanse, splitting the Imperium in two like a blade driven through its core. The great rift, Cicatrix Maledictum, pulsed with malevolent energy that made the screens themselves flicker with interference patterns. "When?" he asked, though the question emerged as barely a whisper. Gilliman's voice carried the exhaustion of a general who had fought too many losing battles. "The rift opened approximately 2 centuries ago, Father. The galaxy is now divided into what we call the Imperium Sanctus and the Imperium Nihilus. Half of our worlds exist beyond our ability to effectively govern or protect them." The Emperor studied the galactic map with growing horror. Entire sectors on the far side of the rift showed as red zones of unknown status. Astropathic communication was sporadic at best, supply lines were severed, and millions of human worlds existed in isolation, cut off from Terra by a barrier of pure chaos. "How many worlds?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Approximately 400,000 Imperial worlds lie beyond the rift," Captain General Valoris replied, consulting data slates that trembled in his gauntleted hands. "Their current status ranges from unknown to confirmed lost. We estimate that between 30 and 50 million human colonies have fallen to various threats since the rift's opening. 50 million worlds, potentially trillions of human lives, lost not to conquest or rebellion, but to the simple inability of the Imperium to maintain contact across the wound that had been torn through the galaxy's heart. But the Great Rift was only the beginning of the horror story the cogitators had to tell. As the display shifted to show threat assessments across the galaxy, the Emperor found himself confronted with enemies that dwarfed anything he had faced during the Great Crusade. The first images showed Tyranid hive fleets, their living ships moving like antibodies through the galactic medium, consuming everything in their path. Entire star systems had been stripped bare, their worlds reduced to lifeless husks, while the biomass was processed into more Tyranid organisms. "The Great Devourer," Guilliman explained, his voice heavy with the weight of military defeats. "Hive Fleet Behemoth, Hive Fleet Kraken, Hive Fleet Leviathan, each one larger than the last, each one learning from the failures of its predecessors. They come from beyond the galactic rim in numbers that mock our ability to comprehend them." The display showed battle reports from dozens of worlds where Imperial forces had fought the Tyranids to standstills that could charitably be called Pyrrhic victories. Macragge itself had barely survived Hive Fleet Behemoth's assault. Hundreds of other worlds had not been so fortunate. "They consume everything," the Emperor said, watching footage of Tyranid bioships stripping the atmosphere from a garden world that had once housed 12 billion souls. "Every human life, every resource, every trace of what we built. And they grow stronger with each victory," Guilliman confirmed. "Every world they consume provides biomass for larger fleets. Intelligence suggests that what we have faced so far may be merely scouting forces compared to the main Tyranid presence still approaching from intergalactic space." The threat assessment shifted to show another enemy that filled the Emperor with a different kind of dread. Necron tomb worlds, their locations marked in silver across the galactic display, represented technology so advanced it made even his own achievements seem primitive by comparison. "The Necrons," he said, the name carrying the weight of ancient memory. "They wake." "Across the galaxy," Valoris confirmed. "Ancient tomb worlds, stirring to life after 65 million years of slumber. Their technology is beyond our understanding, their numbers potentially limitless, and their goal appears to be nothing less than the reclamation of a galaxy they consider rightfully theirs." The display showed battles where space marine companies had been annihilated by handfuls of Necron warriors, their weapons capable of flaying targets at the molecular level or trapping them in pocket dimensions. Entire Imperial fleets had been destroyed by Necron vessels that simply phased out of existence when damaged, only to reappear moments later fully repaired. But perhaps most horrifying was what the cogitators revealed about the chaos forces that had grown in strength during his 10,000 years of torment. The Eye of Terror had expanded, birthing new demon worlds and allowing the ruinous powers to establish permanent footholds in real space. Demon Primarchs led incursions that carved through Imperial defenses like fire through parchment. "My sons," the Emperor whispered, watching tactical displays that showed Magnus the Red's Thousand Sons sorcerers tearing holes in reality itself, allowing demon legions to pour through into Imperial space. Angron manifests regularly, Guilliman reported with clinical detachment that barely concealed his pain. His demon form leads Cornite incursions that have claimed dozens of worlds. Mortarian's death guard spreads plague across entire sectors. Fulgrim's Emperor's children, the depravities they inflict on captured populations are beyond description. The Emperor watched in silence as the display showed the aftermath of a Slaaneshi raid on a hive world. Billions of corpses arranged in patterns that formed obscene geometries, their faces locked in expressions of agony and ecstasy combined. Children flayed alive to create living instruments that screamed hymns to the Dark Prince. Art galleries filled with sculptures made from human bones and suffering souls. This was what his sons had become. Not merely traitors, but active agents of humanity's torment, wielding powers that turned human achievement into raw material for cosmic horror. Yet as devastating as these external threats were, it was the internal state of the Imperium itself that finally broke the Emperor's remaining faith in his great work. The technological stagnation revealed by the cogitator banks was beyond his worst fears. "Show me our technological capabilities," he commanded, though he already suspected what he would find. The data streams that followed were an indictment of 10,000 years of decline, disguised as reverence. STCs, standard template constructs that had once allowed human colonies to bootstrap advanced technology from raw materials, were treated as holy relics rather than manufacturing templates. Their databases had been corrupted by millennia of religious interpretation, turning scientific instructions into religious prayers. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which should have been pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, had instead become a cargo cult that worshipped technology without understanding it. Innovation was heresy. Questioning established doctrine was blasphemy, and the loss of knowledge was accepted as divine will rather than institutional failure. "We can no longer build the ships that carried the Great Crusade across the galaxy," Guilliman reported with bitter frustration. The Gloriana-class battleships are irreplaceable relics. The technology for creating new Primarchs has been lost. Even basic manufacturing techniques that were common during your era are now considered miracle workings requiring decades of ritual preparation. The Emperor studied readouts showing human colonies that had fallen not to invasion or disaster, but to simple mechanical failures. Atmospheric processes that broke down because no one remembered how to repair them. Defense satellites that failed because their control systems required passwords that had been lost centuries ago. Entire worlds abandoned because the knowledge to maintain their infrastructure had been declared too dangerous for mortal minds to comprehend. "You have created a civilization of children playing with weapons they do not understand," he said, his voice heavy with disgust. "A species that has forgotten how to think in favor of learning how to pray." But the greatest horror was yet to come. As the cogitator banks revealed the daily statistics of Imperial life, the Emperor found himself confronted with numbers that defied comprehension. On average, across the million worlds of the Imperium, 11 million humans died every day from causes directly related to Imperial governance. War claimed 3 million daily, not glorious battles for human advancement, but grinding conflicts against enemies that could never be truly defeated, only temporarily contained. Disease took another 2 million, much of it preventable if the Imperium had maintained the medical knowledge that had once been commonplace. Starvation claimed 1 million more, despite the fact that the Imperium controlled agricultural worlds capable of feeding 10 times the current galactic population. But it was the remaining 5 million daily deaths that truly damned the Imperium in the Emperor's eyes. These were the deaths from pure institutional failure, workers killed in industrial accidents because safety protocols had been replaced with prayers, citizens executed for heresies as minor as asking why their children were starving, populations abandoned to alien raiders because bureaucratic delays had prevented military response for decades. 11 million per day, the Emperor repeated, the mathematics of it striking him like physical blows. 4 billion per year, 40 billion per decade, for 10,000 years. The total was beyond comprehension. Roughly 400 trillion human lives lost not to the great enemies of mankind, but to the simple incompetence and cruelty of the system he had created to protect them. And in all of this, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout, how many worlds prosper? How many populations live in anything resembling the golden age I promised them? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Guilliman eventually provided the statistical confirmation that completed the Emperor's understanding of his failure. Perhaps 1 world in 10,000 could be considered prosperous by the standards of your era, Father. The rest endure various degrees of suffering, from simple poverty to conditions that approach the worst excesses of old night. Most imperial citizens live and die without ever knowing that alternatives to suffering exist. The Emperor stood in the center of the galactic display, surrounded by the evidence of 10,000 years of accumulated failure. The galaxy he had sought to unite was divided by warp storms and administrative incompetence. The species he had meant to elevate to greatness had been reduced to cowering supplicants who destroyed their own potential in service to gods who had never asked for their worship. The enemies arrayed against humanity were more numerous and powerful than anything he had faced during the Great Crusade, yet the Imperium's response was to pray harder rather than innovate, to sacrifice more lives rather than develop better strategies, to double down on the very failures that had created the crisis in the first place. "This is what 10,000 years of my vision has accomplished," he said, his words carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "A galaxy where humanity exists in chains of its own forging, where knowledge is heresy and suffering is virtue, where my own sons serve as agents of cosmic horror, while the remainder of my children die by the billions in service to institutions that have forgotten their purpose." He turned away from the galactic display, no longer able to bear the sight of the wound that had been inflicted upon his dream. Behind him, the cogitators continued their endless display of statistics, worlds lost, populations consumed, knowledge forgotten, hope abandoned. "I sought to create a golden age," he continued, his voice growing quieter but more terrible with each word. "I envisioned a humanity that would stride among the stars as masters of their own destiny, guided by reason and united in purpose. Instead, I have created the most effective engine for human suffering in the history of the species." The chamber fell silent, save for the humming of ancient machinery and the distant sound of prayers rising from Terra's countless shrines. Outside, across 1,000,000 worlds and countless orbital habitats, quadrillions of human beings continued their daily struggle against enemies, institutions, and ideologies that existed solely because of choices he had made 10,000 years ago. The Emperor had awakened, hoping to find an Imperium that had strayed from his vision but could be guided back to the light. Instead, he had found a machine for manufacturing human misery that operated with religious precision, turning his greatest dreams into fuel for nightmares that exceeded even chaos in their systematic cruelty. The discovery was complete. The judgment had been rendered. Now, for the first time since his awakening, the Emperor had to decide what he was going to do about it. The weight of that decision pressed down upon him like the mass of a dying star, carrying with it the knowledge that whatever choice he made, billions would die as a consequence. But perhaps, he reflected with bitter clarity, that had always been true. The only difference now was that he could no longer pretend otherwise. Chapter 8. The God Emperor Speaks. The Emperor stood in the Sanctum Astropathicus, surrounded by the greatest concentration of psychic power on Terra outside his own presence. Hundreds of astropaths knelt in perfect circles around the great transmission array, their eyeless faces turned toward him with expressions of religious ecstasy that would have been touching if they had not been so utterly misguided. For 7 days, he had wrestled with the decision that now lay before him. 7 days of weighing the cost of action against the cost of inaction, of measuring the certain chaos his words would unleash against the grinding horror of allowing the Imperium to continue unchanged. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. Every day he delayed, 11 million more of his children died in service to institutions that had forgotten their purpose. Every moment of silence was complicity in a system that had transformed his greatest dreams into fuel for humanity's worst nightmares. Master of the Astropath. Kion Navarro approached with steps that trembled with awe and terror in equal measure. The ancient psyker's withered form was barely visible beneath layers of ceremonial robes, his skull crowned with neural interface ports that gleamed like silver stars in the chamber's ethereal light. "My God, Emperor!" Navarro whispered, his voice thick with the kind of reverence that had replaced rational thought throughout the Imperium. "The astropathic network stands ready to carry your divine words across the galaxy. Every choir on every world awaits your holy message." The Emperor studied the transmission array with eyes that burned with the light of distant suns. This machine, like so much else in his empire, had been perverted from its original purpose. What should have been a tool for coordination and communication had instead become an instrument for spreading religious doctrine and imperial propaganda. "How many will hear my words?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be staggering. "Every astropath in the Imperium, my lord," Navarro replied with pride that rang like funeral bells. "Through them, every planetary governor, every military commander, every ecclesiarch and administratum official. Within hours, your divine proclamation will reach the furthest corners of your sacred realm. Quadrillions of faithful souls will hear the voice of their God speaking directly to them." Quadrillions? The number was beyond comprehension, representing every human life in the galaxy that could still receive astropathic communication. All of them raised from birth to believe in his divinity, taught from childhood that he was the godfather of humanity who watched over them from his golden throne. All of them about to learn that their god was a lie. The Emperor took his place at the center of the transmission array, feeling the psychic field generators humming to life around him. The astropaths began their preparations, their minds linking together in a choir that would amplify his words across the vast distances between stars. "Begin the transmission," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The response was immediate. Across Terra, every voxcaster and communication relay activated simultaneously. On 1,000,000 worlds, astropaths suddenly stiffened as psychic energy beyond their comprehension flooded through their minds. In countless hive cities, shrine worlds, and fortress monasteries, the faithful looked up from their prayers as the voice of their god echoed from speakers that had carried only the words of mortal servants for 10,000 years. "Citizens of the Imperium," the Emperor began, his words carrying across the galaxy with the force of a solar storm. "I am the being you call the God Emperor of mankind. For 10,000 years, I have sat upon the golden throne in silence, sustaining the Astronomicon that guides your ships through the warp. Now, I break that silence to deliver a truth that will shake the foundations of everything you have been taught to believe. Across the galaxy, entire populations fell to their knees at the sound of his voice. On shrine worlds, pilgrims wept openly as the object of their worship spoke to them directly. In Imperial Guard regiments, hardened veterans crossed themselves and whispered prayers of gratitude that their God had finally chosen to address his faithful children. None of them were prepared for what came next. "I am not a god," the Emperor declared, his words striking the galaxy like hammer blows against the very foundations of reality. "I have never been a god. I am a man, powerful beyond the understanding of most, but still only a man. The imperial cult that worships me, the ecclesiarchy that claims to speak in my name, the billion shrines and temples built to honor my supposed divinity, all of it is based upon a lie that I never spoke and never sanctioned." The silence that followed was profound. For a moment that stretched across light years and encompassed quadrillions of human minds, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Then the Emperor continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, carrying condemnation that could have shattered worlds. "I built the Imperium upon the imperial truth, the promise that humanity would be guided by reason, not superstition, by knowledge, not faith, by the pursuit of understanding, not the worship of false gods. I outlawed religion in all its forms, because I knew that faith without understanding breeds ignorance, and ignorance breeds suffering. On Terra, in the great cathedral sanctum, where Cardinal Valdorius had only days before led worship in the Emperor's honor, the assembled clergy listened in growing horror as their god systematically dismantled the foundation of their existence. The Lectitio Divinitatus, the book that claims to contain my divine teachings, was written by one of my sons who fell to chaos corruption, his words twisted by the very powers I sought to deny. Every prayer offered in my name, every life sacrificed to honor my supposed godhood, every act of worship performed in my honor is an abomination that mocks everything I sought to achieve. Across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. On the shrine world of Dimamar, where 10 billion pilgrims had gathered for the festival of the Emperor's ascension, riots broke out within minutes of the transmission. Half the population fell deeper into religious ecstasy, convinced that their god was testing their faith. The other half stood in stunned silence, their entire worldview crumbling beneath the weight of divine revelation. But the Emperor was not finished. "Look upon what 10,000 years of faith has brought you," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "An Imperium where knowledge is heresy and ignorance is virtue. Where billions die daily in service to institutions that have forgotten their purpose. Where my own sons have been corrupted into demon princes because the very forces I sought to deny were fed by the worship you offer in my name." On Macraga, Robut Guilliman listened to his father's words with emotions too complex for easy description. Relief that the lies were finally being exposed warred with terror at the chaos this truth would inevitably unleash. Around him, his ultramarines stood in stunned silence, their gene-enhanced minds struggling to process their Primarch's acknowledgement of what many had long suspected. The Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy, the imperial cult in all its forms. These institutions exist in direct violation of my will and in opposition to everything I sought to build. They are parasites feeding upon humanity's natural desire for meaning and purpose, twisting noble impulses into tools of oppression and control. In the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra, Cardinal Valdorius fell to his knees, not in worship, but in despair. Around him, lesser clerics wailed and tore at their robes as the foundation of their power crumbled. Some cried out that this was a demon speaking with their god's voice. Others simply collapsed beneath the weight of revelation that their entire lives had been built upon falsehood. "I condemn the Inquisition and its methods," the Emperor declared, his words carrying condemnation that burned like fire across the galaxy. No organization should wield the power of life and death without oversight or accountability. The wholesale slaughter of worlds through exterminatus, the persecution of psychers whose only crime is possessing abilities similar to my own, the systematic brutalization of populations in the name of purity. These are not acts of justice, but atrocities that shame every principle I hold sacred. On throne agent stations throughout the galaxy, inquisitors listened to their supreme authority's words with growing panic. Some immediately began issuing orders to ignore the transmission, claiming it was the work of chaos sorcery. Others found themselves questioning decades of certainty, wondering if their righteous crusade against corruption had itself become the very evil they sought to combat. The High Lords of Terra, who claim to govern in my name while the galaxy burns around them, have created a system so Byzantine in its corruption that it serves no purpose save its own perpetuation. They have transformed the promise of human unity into a machine for generating suffering on a scale that exceeds the worst excesses of Old Night. In the council chamber of the High Lords, the 12 most powerful humans in the galaxy listened to their authority's complete repudiation of their rule with terror that transcended mere political concern. This was not merely the loss of legitimacy. This was the complete destruction of the ideological foundation that had justified their power for 10 millennia. To those who would claim that faith has held the Imperium together through dark times, I say this: look upon what your faith has achieved. A galaxy divided by ignorance and superstition. Worlds lost to bureaucratic incompetence. Populations reduced to groveling supplicants who offer their children as sacrifices to a god who never asked for their worship. The Emperor paused, allowing his words to echo across the galaxy before delivering the final, devastating blow. I reject the worship offered in my name. I condemn the institutions that claim to serve me while perpetuating humanity's suffering. I renounce the title of God Emperor and reclaim only what I have always been: a man who sought to guide humanity to greatness among the stars, and who failed so completely that his greatest dreams became fuel for nightmares beyond description. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in stunned silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds before exploding into chaos that would reshape the course of human history. On Terra, the immediate reaction was confusion and panic. Custodians found themselves torn between 10,000 years of conditioning and the direct words of their master. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus questioned whether their worship of the Omnissiah, whom they had identified with the Emperor, was now heretical by his own declaration. But it was beyond Terra that the real chaos began. On the cardinal world of Ophelia 7, the entire planetary government collapsed within hours as half the population declared the transmission to be daemon trickery, while the other half attempted to purge all religious iconography in accordance with their god's will. Sectarian violence erupted in every major hive city as different interpretations of the Emperor's message led to open warfare. The Forge world of Metallica experienced a complete shutdown of production as tech priests debated whether their binary hymns to the Omnissiah now constituted heresy. Some declared that the Emperor's rejection of godhood proved he was testing their faith. Others began systematically purging religious elements from their manufacturing rituals, causing critical systems to fail as technical procedures that had been wrapped in religious ceremony were stripped of their spiritual components. On hundreds of worlds, Imperial Guard regiments found themselves divided between officers who declared the transmission authentic and those who claimed it was chaos sorcery. Some units immediately began purging regimental chaplains and religious iconography. Others turned their weapons on these heretics, sparking military conflicts that left entire planetary defense forces in chaos. The Adeptus Astartes faced their own crisis of faith. Chapters that had spent 10,000 years fighting in the Emperor's name now had to grapple with his explicit rejection of worship and condemnation of the institutions they had served. Some, like the Imperial Fists, accepted their Gene Father's words with stoic determination to adapt. Others, particularly those of the Black Templars, declared the transmission to be the ultimate test of faith and doubled down on their religious fervor. But perhaps most catastrophic was the reaction on worlds where the ecclesiarchy held temporal as well as spiritual power. Cardinal worlds that had been ruled by the Adeptus Ministorum for millennia suddenly found their authority questioned by populations who were simultaneously told that their God had spoken and that he rejected their worship of him. On Dimamar, the festival of the Emperor's Ascension became a bloodbath as pilgrims turned on each other in theological riots. On San Leor, the cardinal governor was lynched by mobs who blamed the clergy for perpetuating lies, while other mobs simultaneously formed to protect the churches from demon-corrupted heretics. Within hours of the transmission's end, civil wars had erupted on dozens of worlds. Within days, the number had climbed to hundreds. Entire sectors found themselves paralyzed as conflicting interpretations of the Emperor's message led to breakdowns in military command structures, governmental authority, and basic civil order. The Chaos Powers, sensing opportunity in the confusion, launched coordinated strikes against worlds where imperial defenses had collapsed due to internal strife. Demon incursions that would normally have been contained by unified imperial forces instead found populations too busy fighting each other to mount effective resistance. In the Eye of Terra, the demon primarchs looked upon the growing chaos with satisfaction. Magnus the Red, in particular, found bitter amusement in watching the Imperium tear itself apart over questions of faith and truth, questions he had tried to address 10,000 years ago, only to be condemned as a traitor for his efforts. The Emperor, standing in the now silent Sanctum Astropathicus, felt the psychic emanations of chaos spreading across the galaxy like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Every world that descended into civil war, every life lost to theological violence, every institution that collapsed under the weight of revealed truth, all of it was a direct consequence of his decision to speak. Was this wisdom or folly? Guilliman asked quietly, having arrived to witness the aftermath of his father's proclamation. The Emperor considered the question while feeling the distant screams of worlds burning as his children turned on each other in the name of serving his will. Both, he replied finally, and perhaps that is the most human thing I have done in 10,000 years. Outside, across Terra and a million other worlds, the Imperium began the process of tearing itself apart, not in service to chaos, not conquered by alien enemies, but divided by the simple truth that their God had never wanted to be worshipped. The Reformation had begun. Whether it would lead to rebirth or complete collapse remained to be seen. But the silence of 10 millennia was broken forever, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 9. The Purging of Terra. The Emperor stood in the council chamber of the High Lords, but he no longer stood alone. Behind him, A phalanx of custodians in golden armor waited with weapons drawn, their ancient loyalty finally given clear direction after 10,000 years of uncertainty. Before him, the 12 most powerful humans in the galaxy knelt not in worship, but in the trembling posture of prisoners awaiting judgment. "Rise," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your time of kneeling is over." The High Lords rose with the uncertain movements of men who had just watched the foundation of their power crumble beneath the weight of divine revelation. Lord Commander Militant Barbarossa's hands shook as he attempted to maintain his ceremonial posture, while Master of the Administratum Gol clutched his data slates like a drowning man grasping for driftwood. "For 10,000 years, the Emperor began, his words cutting through the chamber like a blade through silk. "You have ruled in my name while transforming my vision into an engine of human suffering. You have created bureaucracies that serve no purpose save their own perpetuation. You have allowed corruption to flourish while worlds burned for lack of aid. You have sanctioned the murder of quadrillions through incompetence, negligence, and willful indifference to human suffering." Inquisitor Representative Rext stepped forward, his black armor gleaming in the chamber's ethereal light. Even now, faced with the condemnation of the being he claimed to serve, his conditioning demanded one last attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "My lord," he said, his mechanically modulated voice carrying the certainty of absolute faith, "everything we have done in your name, and for the preservation of your sacred Imperium. The harsh measures, the necessary sacrifices." The Emperor's psychic presence flared, and Rext's words died in his throat as raw power pressed down upon him like the weight of a collapsing star. "Necessary?" the Emperor repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a roar. "You call the systematic brutalization of my people necessary? You justify the murder of 14 quadrillion souls as sacrifice? You defend institutions that have transformed the promise of human advancement into fuel for cosmic horror?" The silence that followed was profound. For long moments, the only sound in the chamber was the soft whir of ancient ventilation systems and the distant rumble of Terra's eternal activity. "Captain General Valoris," the Emperor said finally, his gaze never leaving the kneeling High Lords, "arrest them all." The order struck the chamber like a thunderbolt. For 10,000 years, the High Lords had been the ultimate authority in the Imperium, answerable to no one save the silent figure upon the golden throne. The concept of their arrest was so fundamentally alien that several of them simply stood in stunned incomprehension. "My lord," Fabricator General Xylos protested, his mechanical voice buzzing with electronic distortion, "the Imperium requires governance, the administrative systems, the military coordination, the resource allocation. Without the High Lords, the Empire will collapse into chaos." "The Empire has already collapsed into chaos," the Emperor replied, with deadly calm. "The only difference is that now it will be honest chaos, rather than chaos disguised as order." The custodians moved with the fluid precision of master warriors, surrounding each High Lord with golden forms that made resistance not merely futile, but unthinkable. Yet even as restraint fields activated, and the most powerful humans in the galaxy found themselves prisoners in their own council chamber, the true magnitude of what was happening began to ripple outward through Terra itself. In the ecclesiarchal palace, Cardinal Valdorius received word of the High Lord's arrest through channels that had carried similar messages for millennia. But this was not a routine transfer of power or a political purge. This was the systematic dismantling of institutions that had governed humanity for longer than most civilizations had existed. "Summon the Frateris militia," he commanded, his voice thick with the fervor of a man who saw his life's work crumbling before his eyes. "If the daemon that speaks with our God Emperor's voice seeks to destroy the sacred institutions of faith, then the faithful must defend what the true Emperor built." The response was immediate. Across Terra, millions of religious zealots who had spent their lives in service to the imperial creed suddenly found themselves faced with direct orders to ignore their god's explicit commands. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, and different groups resolved it in different ways. Some, particularly among the younger and more idealistic members of the ecclesiarchy, accepted the emperor's words as divine revelation and began the process of purging religious iconography from their temples. Others, led by senior clerics who had invested decades in building power through religious hierarchy, declared the transmission to be demon trickery and called for armed resistance against the forces of corruption. The result was inevitable. Within hours of the High Lord's arrest, the first violence erupted in the cathedral districts of Terra itself. The Emperor, meanwhile, had moved to the Administratum Archivum, the vast complex that housed the bureaucratic records of 1,000,000 worlds. Here, surrounded by databanks that contained the accumulated paperwork of 10,000 years of imperial governance, he began the process of restoring the imperial truth as official doctrine. "Delete it all," he commanded, his words carrying across chambers filled with clerks, scribes, and administrative officials who had spent their lives maintaining records they barely understood. Every religious edict, every theological interpretation, every piece of bureaucratic procedure that references divine will or sacred duty, replace it with clear, rational instructions for governance based on human need rather than religious doctrine. The reaction was immediate panic. Senior administrators who had built their careers on interpreting religious law found themselves suddenly obsolete. Filing clerks who had spent decades organizing documents according to theological importance watched as entire classification systems were declared null and void. "My lord," protested Chief Archivist Morlan, a withered man whose hunched form spoke of centuries spent bent over ancient documents. "The administrative codes are integrated with religious observances at every level. We cannot simply delete references to sacred duty without destroying the entire governmental structure." "Then destroy it," the Emperor replied without hesitation. "Better an honest collapse than a lie that perpetuates suffering." But it was in the great cathedral sanctum, where only days before Cardinal Valdorius had led worship in the Emperor's honor, that the true scope of the challenge became clear. The massive religious complex that had grown up around the imperial palace was not merely a collection of buildings. It was a city-sized monument to 10,000 years of accumulated faith. Custodians moved through the cathedral's vast halls with plasma cutters and melter charges, systematically destroying religious iconography that had been crafted by master artisans over the course of millennia. Statues of the Emperor in divine poses were reduced to molten slag. Stained glass windows depicting his supposed miracles were shattered into fragments that caught the light like tears. Yet for every shrine destroyed, a dozen more remained. The sheer scale of Terra's religious infrastructure was staggering, a testament to humanity's desperate need for meaning in a universe that seemed determined to crush their hopes. And not all of it was destroyed without resistance. Tribune Axial approached the Emperor as he supervised the demolition of a particularly elaborate shrine to the God Emperor's supposed victory over the forces of chaos. The ancient custodian's golden armor bore fresh scorch marks from plasma fire, and his normally perfect posture showed signs of strain. "My lord," he reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion and confusion, "we have encountered armed resistance in the southern cathedral districts. Frateris militia units are attempting to prevent the removal of religious iconography. They claim they are defending the true faith against demon-possessed impostors wearing our forms. The Emperor's expression darkened. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that his own people were willing to fight his personal guards rather than accept that their god had rejected their worship. Casualties? He asked, though he already dreaded the answer. 17 custodians wounded, none killed, Axial replied. The Frateris militia losses are significant. They fight with the fervor of martyrs, my lord. They believe that dying in defense of your temples will earn them a place at your side in the afterlife. The irony was profound. His people were dying to defend temples he wanted destroyed, offering their lives to honor a god who had explicitly rejected their worship, fighting his personal guards because they could not accept that their divine father had never wanted to be divine at all. And the other custodians? The Emperor asked. How do they respond to orders that contradict 10,000 years of tradition? Axial's hesitation was answer enough, but he provided the details anyway. Many struggle with the contradiction, my lord. We have spent 10 millennia guarding the God Emperor's temples, protecting the faithful who came to worship at your shrines, maintaining the rituals that honored your divine majesty. Now we are asked to destroy what we have spent our lives protecting. The Emperor nodded, understanding perhaps for the first time the true scope of the challenge he faced. This was not merely a matter of issuing new orders or changing official doctrine. He was asking an entire civilization to abandon fundamental beliefs that had shaped their worldview for longer than most species had existed. Some have requested reassignment to duties that do not require them to act against the faithful, Axial continued. Others have accepted your commands but struggle with the implications. A few. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. A few have suggested that perhaps the creature, speaking with your voice, is not truly the Emperor they have served. The words hit the Emperor like physical blows. Even among his most loyal guardians, doubt was beginning to spread. If the custodians themselves questioned his identity when his commands contradicted their conditioning, what hope was there for the broader population? Outside the cathedral complex, the violence was spreading. Frateris militia units clashed with Imperial Guard regiments that had accepted the Emperor's broadcast as authentic. Religious zealots who had spent their lives in service to the Imperial creed found themselves fighting fellow believers who interpreted their god's message differently. The sound of combat echoed through Terra's ancient corridors as the throne world itself began to fracture along theological lines. In the hive spires, different districts declared for different interpretations of the Emperor's message. Some purged all religious iconography in accordance with his commands. Others barricaded themselves behind improvised fortifications, declaring that they would defend the true faith against all enemies, even if those enemies claimed to speak with their god's voice. It was then that the reports began arriving from across the galaxy. Astropathic messages, fragmentary and often contradictory, painted a picture of an Imperium tearing itself apart as different worlds, different systems, different sectors chose different responses to their god's revelation. Some worlds had accepted the Emperor's message and begun the process of dismantling religious infrastructure. Others had declared the transmission to be demon trickery and doubled down on their faith. Still others had simply collapsed into chaos as competing interpretations led to civil wars that made unified resistance against external threats impossible. The cost is already staggering, Guilliman reported as he entered the cathedral chamber, where the Emperor supervised the ongoing demolition. 17 sectors have reported complete breakdowns in governmental authority. The Chaos powers are exploiting the confusion to launch coordinated strikes, We've lost contact with 43 worlds in the last 6 hours alone. The Emperor continued watching as custodians used melter charges to destroy a massive golden statue of himself seated upon the golden throne, crowned with a halo of stars and wielding lightning as both scepter and sword. The artistic craftsmanship was extraordinary, the work of master sculptors who had devoted their lives to honoring their god through their art. Regrets? Guilliman asked quietly. The Emperor considered the question while listening to the distant sounds of combat echoing through Terra's corridors. Below, his people fought and died over questions of faith and truth, their conflicts sparked by his decision to speak honestly about his nature and intentions. The truth was always going to be catastrophic, he replied finally. The only question was whether to let the lies continue generating suffering or to replace them with honest chaos. And if the honest chaos proves worse than the dishonest order? The Emperor's silence stretched for long moments as another explosion echoed through the cathedral complex, marking the destruction of yet another shrine to his supposed divinity. Then I will have proven that some truths are too dangerous to speak, he said finally. But at least the blood spilled will be over reality rather than illusion. Outside, across Terra and a million other worlds, the Imperium continued its painful transformation from a theocracy based on lies to something else entirely. Though what that something would be remained unclear. The Reformation had begun in earnest, and there could be no turning back. Whether it would lead to rebirth or complete collapse, only time would tell. But the sound of shattering glass and crumbling stone that echoed through the imperial palace spoke to the magnitude of what was being destroyed and the uncertainty of what would rise from its ashes. The purging of Terra had begun. The galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 10. Galaxy Ablaze. The Emperor stood before the great tactical display in the Imperial Palace's command center, watching as the galaxy burned with the fire of civil war that his words had ignited. Each flickering light on the holographic map represented not conquest or liberation, but worlds tearing themselves apart as his children chose sides in a conflict that had no victors, only degrees of loss. Report, he commanded. Though every update brought fresh evidence of the catastrophe his awakening had unleashed upon the Imperium. Captain General Valoris approached with data slates that trembled in his gauntleted hands. The ancient custodian's golden armor bore fresh scorch marks from the ongoing violence on Terra itself, testament to the fact that even the throne world had not been spared the madness that was consuming the galaxy. 47 sectors have declared the astropathic transmission to be demon trickery, my lord, he reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion and barely concealed despair. They refuse all communications from Terra and have begun purging Imperial officials who acknowledge your rejection of divinity. The words struck the Emperor like physical blows. 47 sectors, millions of worlds, trillions of human lives had chosen to believe that their god would never reject their worship, and therefore anyone claiming to do so must be an impostor wearing his voice. The ecclesiarchy? He asked, though he already suspected what he would hear. Cardinal Escherion has declared himself the true voice of the god Emperor, Valoris continued, consulting the data slates with the mechanical precision of a man reporting the casualties of a war he could not understand. He claims that the being on Terra is either a demon of extraordinary power or a corrupted shell animated by chaos sorcery. 700 cardinal worlds have declared for his interpretation, and they are mobilizing Frateris militia, forces numbering in the billions. The Emperor closed his eyes, feeling the psychic emanations of hatred and confusion rippling across the galaxy, like waves from a stone cast into troubled waters. His attempt to free humanity from the chains of false worship had instead created the largest religious war in human history. "Show me the Astartes' response," he said, opening eyes that burned with the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of failure. The tactical display shifted to show the disposition of Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, but instead of the unified force he had once commanded during the Great Crusade, he saw a patchwork of conflicting loyalties that spoke to the fundamental fracture his words had created. "The Ultramarines, Imperial Fists and Salamanders have accepted your declaration," Valoris reported. "They are implementing new chapter doctrines based on the Imperial truth and have begun purging religious elements from their practices. However, the Emperor braced himself for what he knew would be devastating news. The Black Templars have declared the transmission to be the ultimate test of faith. They are leading a coalition of 14 other chapters in what they call the True Crusade, a holy war against the forces of heresy that they believe have corrupted Terra itself. They consider any Space Marine who abandons the Imperial cult to be a traitor worthy of death. On the display, entire sectors showed as red zones where loyalist Space Marines fought each other with the fury once reserved for humanity's greatest enemies. The sight of his genetically enhanced sons, warriors created to protect humanity, slaughtering each other over questions of faith and doctrine, was perhaps the most damning evidence yet of how completely his vision had been corrupted. "The Iron Hands are split down the middle," Valoris continued with clinical detachment that barely concealed his horror. "Half the chapter follows their chapter master's acceptance of your words. The other half, led by a faction claiming the chapter master has been possessed by demon logic, has declared independence and renamed themselves the True Iron. They are systematically hunting down and executing battle brothers who have abandoned what they call proper reverence for the Emperor's divine nature." The Emperor turned away from the display, no longer able to bear the sight of the galaxy-spanning fratricide that his honesty had unleashed. Behind him, the tactical readouts continued their litany of disaster, chapters splitting into warring factions, entire companies going rogue, millennia-old brotherhoods dissolved in the space of days over theological disputes. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the response of the Imperial Guard regiments that had served the Imperium faithfully for 10,000 years. "The Cadian shock troops have refused to acknowledge any orders from Terra," Valoris reported, his voice growing quieter with each revelation. "General Kotov has declared that the true Emperor would never abandon the faithful who have died in his name, and therefore, whoever sits upon the Golden Throne must be an impostor. They are marching on loyalist PDF forces on 17 worlds, claiming to be liberating them from demon corruption." The irony was profound and bitter. The soldiers who had sacrificed everything to defend the Imperium were now fighting to defend it from the very being they claimed to serve, unable to accept that their god might not want the worship they had offered with their blood. "How many regiments remain loyal to Terra?" the Emperor asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Approximately 30% accept your authority," Valoris replied. "Another 20% are undecided or paralyzed by conflicting orders. The remaining 50% have either declared independence or are actively fighting to liberate the Imperium from what they perceive as chaos corruption of the highest levels of government." The mathematics were staggering. Half of the Imperial Guard, billions of soldiers, thousands of regiments that had once formed the backbone of Imperial military power, had effectively seceded from the Imperium rather than accept their god's rejection of godhood. It was then that the reports from beyond the Imperium's borders began arriving, and with them came the true scope of the catastrophe the Emperor's awakening had unleashed. "The Chaos forces are exploiting the confusion," Gilliman announced as he entered the command center, his power armor bearing fresh damage from a desperate engagement on the outskirts of the solar system itself. Magnus leads a combined force of 1,000 suns and demon hosts against the Fenris system, taking advantage of the Space Wolves' internal conflicts over your proclamation. Mortarion has launched plague fleets against 12 agri-worlds, whose defenders were too busy fighting each other to mount effective resistance. The Emperor felt each word like a dagger thrust into his soul. His demon sons, the children who had fallen to chaos through his failures, were now capitalizing on the chaos created by his attempt to correct those very failures. "Angron?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be devastating. "Manifesting on Armageddon," Guilliman replied with the clinical tone of a general reporting casualty figures. "The world's defenders are split between forces loyal to the ecclesiarchy and those attempting to implement your imperial truth. While they slaughter each other in the hive cities, Angron's demon hosts carve through the outer defenses unopposed." The tactical display updated in real time, showing chaos incursions across dozens of systems where Imperial forces had either abandoned their posts to fight in the religious war or were too paralyzed by conflicting orders to mount coordinated resistance. "The Tyranids?" the Emperor asked, though he already suspected what exploitation the Great Devourer might make of Imperial weakness. "Hive Fleet Kraken has accelerated its approach to the Ultima Segmentum," Valoris reported. "Intelligence suggests they are taking advantage of the breakdown in astropathic communication to strike at worlds whose distress calls are being ignored by Imperial forces engaged in theological conflicts." The Emperor studied the tactical display with growing horror. Entire sectors that should have been united in the face of existential threats were instead fragmenting into warring factions, their attention focused inward on questions of faith and doctrine, while their enemies approached unchallenged. The Necrons? Several tomb worlds that had been contained by coordinated Imperial Guard actions have awakened fully, Guilliman confirmed, with the regiments assigned to monitoring duties either withdrawn for religious conflicts or refusing orders from Terra. There was no one to respond when the Necron forces emerged. 3 Forge worlds have gone dark in the last 6 hours. The scope of the disaster was beyond anything the Emperor had imagined possible. His attempt to restore rationality to the Imperium had not merely failed, it had created conditions that allowed humanity's greatest enemies to strike with unprecedented effectiveness against an empire too busy fighting itself to mount unified resistance. "Casualties?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be catastrophic. "Preliminary estimates suggest that more than 50 billion humans have died in religious conflicts since your transmission," Valoris reported, with the hollow tone of a man who had moved beyond horror into simple numbness. That number includes approximately 12 million Space Marines who have fallen in chapter-on-chapter conflicts. Meanwhile, Chaos and Xenos forces have claimed an additional 30 billion lives on worlds where Imperial defenders were absent or compromised. 80 billion human lives lost in the space of days, not to the great enemies of humanity, but to the simple inability of his people to accept that their god had never wanted to be worshipped. The Emperor turned to face the great window that looked out over Terra's endless sprawl. But even the throne world showed signs of the madness that had consumed the galaxy. Smoke rose from a dozen districts, where religious factions continued their violent debates over the nature of divinity and the authenticity of his message. "Was this wisdom?" he asked quietly, his words directed as much to himself as to his son. Guilliman approached carefully, his scarred features bearing the weight of a primarch who had spent centuries trying to hold together an empire that seemed determined to tear itself apart. "You spoke the truth, Father," he said finally. "The fault lies not in the truth itself, but in a civilization that had become so dependent on lies that honesty became poisonous. The Emperor considered this as he watched a pilgrimage convoy being attacked by Frateris militia forces in the distance. The pilgrims, loyal to his words, were attempting to reach the imperial palace to demonstrate their acceptance of his rejection of divinity. The militia, equally loyal to their interpretation of his will, were trying to prevent what they saw as demon-corrupted heretics from approaching their god's sacred presence. Both sides died believing they served him faithfully. "The Imperium may not survive this," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible realization. 10,000 years of accumulated faith cannot be dismantled without destroying the very foundations that hold human civilization together. "Perhaps," Guilliman acknowledged. But what was the alternative? To allow the lies to continue while quadrillions suffered in service to institutions that had forgotten their purpose? The Emperor had no answer to this. Every choice before him led to catastrophic loss of life. Allowing the Imperium to continue in its corrupted state meant the continued systematic brutalization of his people. Attempting to reform it meant civil war and the collapse of humanity's defenses against external threats. "I sought to free my people from the chains of false worship," he said finally, his words heavy with bitter understanding. "Instead, I may have doomed them to extinction." Outside the window, the violence continued as his children fought and died over the question of whether their God was real or false, divine or mortal, savior or destroyer. Each side claimed to serve his will while slaughtering those who disagreed with their interpretation of his nature. The Emperor pressed his hand against the cold glass of the window and felt the psychic emanations of a galaxy in chaos, its ordered structure dissolving into fragments that might never be reassembled. "The road to hell," he whispered, "is paved with the best intentions." Behind him, the tactical displays continued their endless catalogue of disaster as the Imperium of Man, the greatest achievement of human civilization, tore itself apart in service to a god who had never wanted their worship, and now watched helplessly as his honesty became the instrument of their destruction. In the distance, the great bells of Terra tolled not in celebration, but in mourning, their bronze voices carrying across a world where the faithful fought the faithful, while their enemies gathered strength for the final blow. The galaxy burned, and the Emperor could only watch as his greatest dream became humanity's worst nightmare. Chapter 11. The Price of Truth. The Emperor stood before the great astropathic relay arrays, feeling the psychic screams of a dying galaxy wash over him in waves that threatened to drive even his superhuman consciousness to madness. Each transmission brought fresh reports of worlds consumed by the chaos his truth had unleashed, of populations that had turned their weapons on each other rather than accept that their god might not be what they believed. "Mordian Prime has fallen," Captain General Valoris reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion and barely controlled despair. The Iron Guard regiments refused to coordinate with PDF forces who had accepted your proclamation. While they fought each other in the hive cities, a Kornate warband broke through the outer defenses. 18 billion souls lost to demon incursions that could have been easily repelled by unified resistance. The number struck the Emperor like a physical blow. 18 billion human lives, snuffed out not by the inherent evil of chaos, but by his own people's inability to cooperate in the face of existential threat. The mathematical precision of the tragedy was almost more than he could bear. And Tarkos VII? Genestealer cult uprising, Valoris continued with the mechanical precision of a man who had moved beyond horror into simple numbness. The planetary governor was too busy purging ecclesiarchy officials to respond to intelligence reports about cult activity. 22 billion consumed by the brood mind, while loyalist forces debated whether acknowledging your divinity constituted heresy. The Emperor closed his eyes, but even behind his eyelids, he could see the tactical displays that painted the galaxy in shades of red and black. World after world fell dark as humanity's greatest enemies exploited the theological chaos that his honesty had created. "Continue," he said, though each word was like swallowing poison. "The Cadian Gate," Valoris said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The fortress worlds that have held back the eye of Terra for 10,000 years are fracturing. Half the regiments declare for the ecclesiarchy, half for your imperial truth. Abaddon's forces probe the defenses daily, testing for weaknesses in what was once an impregnable barrier. The Cadian Gate, the bulwark that had protected the galaxy from the full fury of chaos for 10 millennia. If it fell because his words had divided its defenders, then quadrillions more would die as demon hordes poured into real space unopposed." "Casualties across all theaters?" the Emperor asked, though he already knew the answer would be catastrophic beyond comprehension. "Preliminary estimates suggest that more than 200 billion humans have died in conflicts directly attributable to your transmission," Valoris replied. "Another 50 billion have fallen to enemies who exploited the chaos for strategic advantage. The death toll continues to climb exponentially as more worlds descend into civil war. 250 billion deaths in a matter of days. More human lives lost than had died in some of the Great Crusade's largest campaigns, all because he had chosen to speak the truth rather than maintain comfortable lies." It was then that Robut Guilliman entered the chamber, his power armor bearing fresh damage from another desperate engagement against forces that should have been allies. The Primarch's scarred features showed a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. This was the bone-deep fatigue of a general who had watched his own species destroy itself over questions that should have united rather than divided them. "Father," Guilliman said, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained frustration. "We need to discuss the practical realities of what you've unleashed." The Emperor turned to face his son, seeing in those ancient features the accumulated weight of 10,000 years spent trying to hold together an empire that had been slowly collapsing from the moment of its creation. "Speak plainly, Robut," he said, though he suspected he already knew what his son would say. "The imperial cult, for all its theological falsehoods, provided something that mere rationality could not," Guilliman began, his words carefully measured but carrying the force of absolute conviction. "It gave quadrillions of humans a reason to endure suffering that would have broken purely rational minds. It provided meaning in a universe that seems designed to crush hope." The Emperor's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as his son continued. "A factory worker on Armageddon, who labored 18 hours a day in toxic conditions, could endure because he believed his suffering served a divine purpose. A guardsman facing certain death against tyrannid hordes could charge into battle because he believed his sacrifice would earn him a place at his god's side. A mother watching her children starve could find comfort in the belief that their suffering was part of some greater plan." Each word struck the Emperor like a dagger thrust. Guilliman was not defending the imperial cult's theological accuracy. He was defending its psychological necessity. "You're saying the lies were more merciful than the truth," the Emperor said, his voice heavy with bitter understanding. "I'm saying that truth without hope is often indistinguishable from despair," Guilliman replied. "And despair is what's killing our people now. They cannot simultaneously abandon their faith, and maintain the will to fight against impossible odds. The Emperor turned back to the tactical displays, watching as another world winked out of contact, whether fallen to enemies or simply too consumed by internal conflict to maintain communication. He could not tell. "Look at what faith has accomplished," he said, gesturing to the sea of red indicators that marked worlds in crisis. "Corruption, oppression, the systematic brutalization of everything I sought to protect. The Inquisition alone has murdered more humans than every Xenos invasion in recorded history." "Yes," Guilliman acknowledged without hesitation. "The Imperial cult became a tool of oppression. But it was also the only thing holding the Imperium together against forces that would have destroyed it completely." The Emperor's silence stretched for long moments as he processed his son's words. Outside, the sounds of continued fighting echoed through Terra's ancient corridors, as religious factions continued their violent debates over the nature of divinity and the authenticity of their god's message. "You believe I was wrong to speak," he said finally. "I believe you were right to want to speak," Guilliman corrected carefully. "But I also believe that 10,000 years of accumulated faith cannot be dismantled without destroying the civilizational structures it has come to support." The astropathic arrays crackled with fresh transmissions, each one carrying reports that made the Emperor's soul recoil. A forge world that had purged all religious elements from its manufacturing rituals found its production lines failing as technical procedures wrapped in spiritual ceremony collapsed without their theological framework. A shrine world that had attempted to implement purely rational governance descended into anarchy as populations raised from birth to expect divine guidance found themselves unable to function without it. "The indoctrination runs deeper than I understood," the Emperor admitted, his words carrying the weight of terrible realization. "They are not simply choosing faith over reason, they are psychologically incapable of functioning without the structures that faith provides." "Precisely," Guilliman said, approaching his father with the careful steps of a man delivering news that would reshape the course of galactic history. "Which brings us to the choice you now face." The Emperor knew what his son would say before the words were spoken, but hearing them aloud still struck him like a blow that threatened to shatter his resolve. "You can continue the Reformation and watch the Imperium tear itself apart while our enemies feast on the wreckage," Guilliman said, with clinical precision. "Or you can find a way to provide the psychological comfort of faith while gradually introducing elements of rational governance." The choice was as clear as it was unbearable. Continue speaking truth and watch humanity destroy itself in theological civil wars, or return to the comfortable lies that had sustained them through 10,000 years of darkness. "You're asking me to become the very thing I swore never to be," the Emperor said, his voice barely audible even to his son's superhuman hearing. "I'm asking you to be what your people need, rather than what you want to be," Guilliman replied with gentle firmness. "The question is not whether you are truly divine, but whether humanity requires the belief that you are in order to survive what's coming." The Emperor studied the tactical displays showing chaos incursions across dozens of sectors, Tyranid hive fleets approaching undefended worlds, Necron tomb complexes awakening, while Imperial forces fought each other over questions of doctrine. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. Humanity faced existential threats that required unified response, but unity was impossible while the species tore itself apart over theological disputes. "If I reclaim the mantle of divinity," he said slowly, "if I allow the Imperial cult to continue while simply reforming its worst excesses, then everything I fought against during the Great Crusade will have been validated." "Perhaps," Guilliman acknowledged. "But if you don't, There may be no humanity left to save from superstition. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of combat and the soft humming of ancient machinery. For long minutes, the Emperor stood frozen by the magnitude of the choice before him. He could feel the psychic emanations of worlds burning as his children fought over his nature. He could sense the approaching darkness of humanity's enemies as they prepared to exploit imperial weakness. Most crushing of all, he could perceive the despair of quadrillions of humans who had lost the faith that had sustained them through lifetimes of suffering, only to find nothing but emptiness in its place. "There is a third option," he said finally, his words so quiet they were barely audible even in the chamber's perfect acoustics. Guilliman's expression shifted, recognizing something in his father's tone that spoke of decisions that would reshape the course of human history. "Father?" The Emperor turned to face his son, and for a moment Guilliman saw not the master of mankind or the God-Emperor, but simply an ancient being who had carried the weight of species-wide responsibility for longer than most civilizations had existed. "What if the problem is not the choice between truth and lies?" the Emperor said, his voice growing stronger with terrible certainty, "but the assumption that I must continue to exist to make that choice." The implications of his words struck Guilliman like a physical blow. In the distance, across Terra and a million other worlds, the Imperium continued its painful dissolution as humanity struggled to reconcile contradictory truths about the nature of divinity and authority. But in that moment, in the silence between his father's words and his own comprehension of their meaning, Guilliman began to understand that the Emperor was contemplating a sacrifice that would dwarf every other decision in the history of their species. The choice between truth and stability might not require choosing at all. It might require removing the figure around whom the entire dilemma revolved. The thought was so profound, so fundamentally paradigm-shifting, that Guilliman found himself unable to respond. He could only stand in stunned silence as his father contemplated the ultimate sacrifice, the voluntary ending of his own existence to free humanity from the theological chains that his continued presence made impossible to break. Outside, the galaxy continued to burn. But in the Imperial Palace's command center, a god contemplated the price of mortality and wondered if death might be the most merciful gift he could give to the children who had worshipped him for so long that they had forgotten how to live without him. The doubt that had begun with his awakening was crystallizing into something far more terrible, the certainty that his greatest act of love for humanity might be his last. Chapter 12. The Silent Throne. The Emperor stood before the Golden Throne for what he knew would be the last time as a free man. The ancient machine hummed with patient power, its life support systems ready to resume their 10,000-year vigil, its psychic amplifiers prepared to carry his consciousness once more into the screaming void of the Imperium. But this time, he would not be a prisoner of necessity. He would be a willing sacrifice to humanity's need for comfortable myths. Behind him, the command center's tactical displays showed the first signs of stabilization across the galaxy. Not the order he had hoped to create through truth, but a fragile peace built upon compromise and carefully managed illusion. It was not the golden age he had dreamed of, but it was survival, and perhaps that was enough. "Are you certain, Father?" Guilliman asked, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding what his gene sire was about to sacrifice. "Once you return to silence, there can be no more awakenings, no more attempts to correct the course through direct intervention." The Emperor turned to face his son, seeing in those ancient features the accumulated wisdom of a being who had spent 10,000 years learning that governance required not ideological purity, but practical compromise. Guilliman understood, as perhaps no other being in the galaxy could, the terrible mathematics of leadership, the moments when doing right meant abandoning what was right. "I have tried honesty," the Emperor replied, his words carrying the weight of absolute finality. "The cost in human lives has been beyond calculation. Now I will try something more difficult. I will try mercy." He approached the great astropathic relay array one final time, feeling the psychic emanations of a galaxy still burning with the chaos his truth had unleashed. But alongside the flames of conflict, he sensed something else. Hope. The fragile possibility that his children might yet find a path between the extremes of fanatical worship and crushing despair. "Begin the final transmission," he commanded, his voice carrying across the chamber, like the tolling of funeral bells. The astropaths took their positions with reverence that had been tempered by revelation, but not destroyed by it. They had heard their god declare himself mortal, had witnessed his rejection of worship, and yet they still served, not because they believed him divine, but because they understood he was necessary. The psychic field generators hummed to life, and once again the Emperor's words prepared to cross the vast distances between stars. But this time, he would not speak truth. He would speak necessity. "My children," he began, his voice carrying across the galaxy with the force of solar wind, "I have watched with growing sorrow as my words divided, rather than united you. I sought to free you from the chains of false worship, but I failed to understand that some chains become so integral to the structure they bind that removing them causes collapse rather than liberation. Across the galaxy, populations that had been locked in theological warfare paused in their conflicts to hear their god's final words. On Terra itself, the fighting in the cathedral districts slowly ceased as armed factions lowered their weapons to listen. "I spoke to you of truth, but I failed to temper truth with wisdom," the Emperor continued, his words carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated understanding. "I am indeed mortal, as I told you, but mortality does not diminish the responsibility I bear for your welfare, nor does it change the fact that you require more than mortality can provide." The transmission paused, allowing his words to sink into the collective consciousness of a species that had been struggling to reconcile their need for meaning with the stark reality of cosmic indifference. "Therefore I make this covenant with you. I will return to my vigil upon the golden throne, not as a god, but as your guardian. I will maintain the astronomicon that guides your ships through the warp. I will hold back the demon hordes that would devour your souls. I will be what you need me to be, rather than what I wish to be." Cardinal Valdorius, listening from the ruins of his power on Terra, wept openly as he heard his god's words. Not tears of joy at divine revelation, but tears of understanding at a sacrifice that transcended theological categories. "The imperial cult will continue," the Emperor declared, his words striking the galaxy like hammer blows forged from necessity rather than truth. "But it will be reformed. No more will quadrillions die in my name for the crime of rational thought. No more will the Inquisition wield unchecked power over life and death. No more will the pursuit of knowledge be declared heretical by those who have forgotten that stagnation is the true enemy of humanity." Across the galaxy, inquisitors and ecclesiarchs listened with emotions too complex for easy description. Their authority would continue, but constrained by oversight and tempered by mercy. It was not the destruction of their institutions they had feared, but it was not the validation of their excesses they might have hoped for either. "Lord Guilliman will serve as my regent in the material realm," the Emperor continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. He will implement reforms gradually, over centuries rather than days, allowing human nature time to adapt to change rather than being broken by it. Those who serve the Imperium faithfully will find purpose and meaning. Those who oppose necessary change will find themselves isolated and powerless. Guilliman bowed his head, accepting the burden of governance that would define the remainder of his existence. It was not the crusade of liberation he might have preferred, but it was the patient work of civilization, building better tomorrows one careful decision at a time. To those who declared me false or demon-corrupted, the Emperor said, his voice carrying forgiveness rather than condemnation, know that your faith was not misplaced, only misdirected. You sought to serve something greater than yourselves, and that impulse is noble even when its expression is flawed. That impulse will be honored and channeled toward humanity's advancement rather than its stagnation. The transmission began to draw toward its close, and with it the Emperor's last moments as a speaking being rather than a silent guardian. I go now to resume my watch over humanity, not in defeat but in acceptance that love sometimes requires sacrifice of the beloved's preferences for their needs. I will speak no more, but I will endure. The golden age you seek may come, but it will come slowly, built by your hands, rather than gifted by divine intervention. The Emperor paused, allowing his final words to carry the weight of both ending and beginning. Remember this above all else. You are my children, and I am proud of you. Not because you worship perfectly, but because you endure imperfectly. Not because you never fail, but because you always try again. The galaxy is dark and full of horrors, but it is also filled with human light that no darkness can entirely extinguish. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in a silence that felt different from the confusion that had followed his first message. This was not the silence of shock, but the silence of acceptance, the quiet moment before the work of rebuilding could begin. The Emperor walked slowly toward the golden throne, each step carrying him further from the freedom of conscious choice and closer to the eternal vigil that would define the remainder of his existence. Behind him, Guilliman and the custodians watched with emotions too profound for expression as their master voluntarily embraced a fate that had once been imposed upon him. "Father," Guilliman said quietly, his voice barely audible even in the chamber's perfect acoustics, "will you be able to remain yourself through the centuries of silence?" The Emperor paused at the foot of the golden throne, his hand resting upon the ancient machinery that would soon claim his consciousness once more. "I will be what I have always been," he replied, his voice already beginning to fade as the throne's systems prepared to receive him. A man who loved his species enough to become what they needed, rather than what he wanted to be. He settled into the throne's embrace, feeling the life support systems engaging, the psychic amplifiers beginning their ancient work of carrying his consciousness into the warp. The tubes and cables that would sustain his body began their eternal function, but this time they felt less like chains and more like tools, instruments of service rather than imprisonment. "Guilliman," he said, his voice growing weaker as the throne's systems drew his consciousness away from his body and into the realm of pure thought. "Remember, reform must be gradual, but it must be constant. Give them hope without lies, purpose without fanaticism, meaning without madness." "I will, Father," Guilliman promised, his words carrying the weight of an oath that would shape the course of galactic civilization for millennia to come. The Emperor's eyes began to dim as the golden throne's full power engaged, drawing his awareness into the psychic realm where he would stand guard against the demon hordes of the warp. But before the silence claimed him entirely, he spoke his final words, not as god or emperor, but as a father, taking leave of children he would protect, but no longer guide. "The dream endures," he whispered, his voice fading into the eternal hum of ancient machinery, different than I imagined, but enduring nonetheless. "Watch over them, my son. Help them become what they can be, not what I failed to make them." The words faded into silence, but it was not the oppressive silence of defeat. It was the quiet of a vigil resumed by choice, of sacrifice made not from weakness, but from strength, of love expressed not through control, but through service. Across the galaxy, the effects were immediate and profound. Worlds that had been locked in theological warfare began the slow process of reconciliation. The ecclesiarchy, chastened by divine rebuke but not destroyed, began implementing reforms that emphasized service over power. The Inquisition found its authority constrained by oversight, but its purpose validated, hunting genuine threats rather than ideological dissent. It was not the golden age the Emperor had once dreamed of bringing to humanity, but it was something perhaps more valuable. The hope of gradual improvement, the possibility of change without catastrophe, the promise that his children might yet find their way to greatness through their own efforts rather than divine intervention. On Terra, the great bells began to toll, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement of a sacrifice that transcended categories of victory or defeat. The God Emperor had returned to his eternal vigil, but he had done so as the Emperor of mankind, choosing to serve rather than rule, to guard rather than govern, to love rather than lead. The golden throne hummed with renewed purpose, its occupant no longer a prisoner of necessity, but a willing guardian of humanity's future. The Astronomicon blazed with light that would guide human ships safely through the warp for millennia to come, powered not by hatred or ambition, but by love too profound for easy expression. The galaxy was still dark, still dangerous, still filled with horrors that tested human endurance to its limits, but it was also filled with hope, the gradual, patient hope of a species that had learned to value improvement over perfection, progress over purity, and the difficult work of building better tomorrows over the false comfort of impossible dreams. The Emperor's awakening was over, but his watch continued. Silent now, but constant. Protective now, but unobtrusive. Loving now, but wise enough to let his children make their own mistakes and learn from their own choices. The dream hadn't died, it had simply learned to wear a more human face. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the soft glow of life support systems and the gentle hum of psychic amplifiers, the master of mankind embraced the silence that would be his portion until the end of time. And across 1,000,000 worlds, humanity began the slow work of building the golden age their father had dreamed of, one careful choice at a time.